Hello, dear friend, and welcome to this quiet hour. Wherever you are right now, whatever this day held for you, it's behind you now. The night has come, and the night is gentle, and there is nothing left to do. Nothing to finish, nothing to remember, nothing to carry forward into this darkness. You've done enough. You can set it all down. If you haven't already, let yourself settle into wherever you're lying. Feel the weight of the blanket across you, the softness beneath you, the way the bed holds you without asking anything in return. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw soften. Let your hands rest open if they've been holding on to anything. Take a breath in, slow and easy, and let it go. You don't have to sleep right away. You don't have to do anything right away. Just breathe. Just be still. The night is wide and unhurried, and so are we. In a little while, I'm going to tell you a story. It's a very old story, older than almost any you know, and it comes from a hillside far away and long ago. There's a boy in it, a young shepherd sitting alone with his flock under a sky full of stars. There's a small fire and cool night air, and the sound of sheep breathing softly in the dark around him. There are no battles in this story, no dragons, nothing to be afraid of. There is only the night, and the boy, and the psalms that began to grow in him out of the stillness, songs that have comforted the frightened, the grieving, the weary, the sleepless, for thousands of years. These are the psalms, and tonight they'll come to you the way they came to him, slowly, gently, one after another, until sleep finds you. So close your eyes now, if they're not already closed. Let your breathing slow. The story is ready, and the night is quiet, and there's nowhere else to be. Let us go back together, a very long way back, to the dark hills of Judea, where a young shepherd is keeping watch over his flock, and the night is just beginning to deepen. His name was David. On this particular night he was very young, perhaps barely past the age when a boy first begins to feel the weight of a man's responsibilities. The hillside he sat upon was rough with stones and dry summer grass, and the particular silence that comes when the wind drops and everything becomes still. He was not a king, not yet, not for many years yet. He was simply a boy with a wooden staff laid across his knees and a small fire built carefully between 3 flat stones. The flock was settled around him in the dark, breathing the slow and even breath of animals that feel safe. He had brought them here before many times, up through the dry ravines and along the limestone ridges that ran south of Bethlehem. He knew this hillside the way a person knows a room they have slept in all their life, the shape of it, the smell of it, the way sound moved across it differently at different hours of the night. The air had cooled quickly, as it always did in these hills once the sun was gone. During the day the stones held the heat, and the grass smelled almost sweet in it. But now the warmth had lifted, and in its place came something cleaner, a coolness that carried the faint smell of dust and dry time and the wool of the sheep themselves. He pulled his cloak a little closer and watched the fire. It was a small fire, just enough for light and a little warmth, the kind a shepherd learns to make when he has done this enough nights that he no longer needs a large one. Far below in the valley, there were other fires. He could see them, very small, like sparks that had come to rest on the ground and decided to stay. Villages, perhaps, or other encampments. Other people settling into the hours of darkness with their own bread and their own concerns. Up here on the hillside, he was separate from all of that. The distance was not lonely. It was simply wide, and he had made a kind of peace with wideness a long time ago. The sheep shifted occasionally, one of them turning, another settling its chin more comfortably against the flank of the one beside it. He knew their sounds. He knew which rustling meant nothing and which meant something to look toward. Tonight every sound was nothing, only the small movements of rest, the soft percussion of hooves on stone, the gentle exhale that travels through a flock the way a breeze travels through grass. They trusted him. They trusted him without thinking about trust, the way all creatures trust the presence that has never failed them. That trust was something he felt tonight as a kind of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He had been sitting here long enough that his legs had gone a little numb against the stone. He had shifted once and then gone still again. The stars were coming now, one at a time and then more quickly, opening out of the darkness above him the way they always did, as if they had been there all along, waiting for the light to leave. He watched them appear. He always watched them appear on nights like this, when there was nothing else to do but tend and wait, and be present to the wide, quiet fact of the night itself. Around him the sheep breathed and shifted, their wool pale in the growing dark. Above him the first stars were beginning to appear. Something inside him was beginning, very slowly, to find its shape in words. He thought first, as he so often did when the night grew quiet enough for thinking, about what it meant to be a shepherd. Not the weariness of it, not the long hours, but the relationship of it. The way a flock trusted without understanding. The way a good shepherd knew each animal by name and sound and habit. There was one ewe near the edge of the flock, older than the rest, who always drifted a little to the left when she was uncertain. He knew this about her the way you know something without ever having decided to learn it. It had simply settled into him over many seasons, the way the smell of the hills settles into cloth. He knew which lamb grew restless before a weather change. He knew which of the young ones needed to hear his voice before it would settle at a strange sound in the brush. He knew them, and they, in their way, knew him. They didn't understand the path he chose for them. They didn't know why he turned the flock away from certain ground, why he led them toward water they couldn't yet see or smell. They simply followed, because following him had always been safe. He sat with that thought for a while, turning it slowly, the way you turn a smooth stone in your hand without any particular purpose, just feeling the shape of it. What would it mean, he wondered, to be the sheep rather than the shepherd? What would it mean to trust so completely that the question of where you were going simply didn't arise? "The Lord is my shepherd," he said quietly, "to no one, to the fire, to the dark. I shall not want." He had known those words since boyhood, had heard them in the rhythms of his own father's prayers, but tonight they fell differently on him, the way familiar ground looks different when the light changes. "I shall not want, not I shall not suffer, not I shall not walk through difficult country, not I shall not know weariness or thirst or the long afternoon miles. Only this, I shall not want. Whatever is needed, it will be there. Whatever the flock requires, the shepherd provides. And if the shepherd above all shepherds is the Lord himself, then the one who knows every wandering ewe, every lamb born crooked in a cold spring, every animal by sound and name and habit, that one is tending you. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures," David murmured. And even the murmuring of it was restful, the words themselves like soft ground beneath him. "He leadeth me beside the still waters." He knew about still waters. A rushing stream terrified sheep. He had learned this early, had watched young animals freeze at the edge of moving water, their feet planted, their eyes wide with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite reason, but was simply the deep animal knowledge that rushing water was dangerous, that it could carry them away. The good shepherd didn't force them into it. He found the places where the water slowed, where it pooled in the shade of a rock, or spread wide and shallow across flat ground, quiet enough that the sheep could see their own reflections, quiet enough that they could drink without panic. He leadeth me beside the still waters, not dragging, not commanding from behind, leading. There is gentleness in that word that David felt now as he sat in the firelight with the flock breathing softly around him. The one who leads knows where the still water is. The one who is led doesn't need to know. That is the whole arrangement. That is the whole mercy of it. He restoreth my soul. David was quiet for a moment after that. He'd known what it was to need his soul restored. He'd known evenings on this hill when something inside him was wrung out and thin, when the long hours had cost him more than just physical tiredness, when he carried a weight he couldn't have named. And he'd known, too, those moments when something shifted, not dramatically, not with any great event to point to, only a settling, a returning, as if something that had been pulled away from its right place had gently been put back. He hadn't always known what to call it. Now he had a word for it. Restoration. The shepherd restores the sheep that has wandered and worn itself ragged on the wrong ground, brings it back to the green place, lets it lie down, gives it water, and the soul comes back to itself. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. For his name's sake. David understood something in this that he hadn't fully understood as a child. A shepherd's reputation was bound up in his flock. You could read the quality of a shepherd in the animals themselves, their condition, their calm, the way they moved together, the way they came to the shepherd's call. God's name was bound up in the people he kept, in the paths he led them down, in the evidence of his care visible in their lives. He leads us in right paths not only for our good, but because his name is on us, because where we go and how we fare reflects the one who tends us. David looked at the small fire. It had settled lower since he'd last added wood, and the coals at its center were a deep, breathing red. Around him the dark was complete and warm, the kind of dark that is not frightening but merely private, the world drawing its curtains and keeping the night to itself. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. He said it carefully, without hurry. He'd walked valleys like that, not the kind that appear on maps, but the inner kind, the ones that come when the night is wrong somehow, when a sound from the far edge of the flock makes the back of your neck go cold, when you're very alone and very small and the dark seems to have weight and intention. He knew about those valleys. Every shepherd did. I will fear no evil. Not I will not feel afraid. He noticed this. Not a promise that the valley would feel safe. Not a promise that the heart wouldn't quicken. Only that evil itself need not be feared, because the fear of evil is a different thing from the awareness of danger. The valley was real. The shadow was real. But evil could not claim him there, because he was not walking through the valley alone. Thou art with me. That was everything. That was the whole of it. Thou art with me. The shepherd doesn't send the sheep through the valley. He walks with them through it. His presence doesn't remove the valley from the path. It removes the isolation from the walking. And isolation is the thing that makes the dark places truly terrible. Take that away. Place a sure and knowing presence beside you in the shadow, and the valley becomes something you can pass through, something with an end, something that leads out the other side. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. The rod was for protection, heavy enough to drive away what threatened. The staff was for guidance, that long curved hook that could reach a sheep gone astray over difficult ground and bring it gently back without injury. Both were comfort, not softness exactly. Comfort in the older sense of the word, the sense that means strength given to another, courage shared, the kind of steadiness that passes from one person to another simply by being present and prepared. David held his own staff across his knees and felt the worn wood of it, smooth from many nights like this one. He thought then about the table. This was the part of the psalm that always surprised him a little, moved him from image to image, in a way that felt almost like waking from one dream into another. A table prepared, in the presence of enemies. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. What a thing to imagine. Not a table in a safe room with friends. Not a meal taken after the danger has passed. A table set out in the open, in full view of those who would do harm, and the invitation to sit at it and eat and not be anxious, because the host has prepared it, because the host stands between the guest and everything that threatens. You can eat, you can be fed, the meal is provided, and the presence of enemies cannot interrupt it, because the one who prepared the table is the same one whose rod and staff are already in hand, the same one who led through the valley without losing a single sheep. Thou anointest my head with oil. David touched his own forehead lightly in the firelight, almost without meaning to. Oil on the head was honor. It was welcome. It was the sign given to a guest who is truly received, truly valued, not merely tolerated in someone's home. To be anointed was to be declared precious in this place, to be known as someone whose presence mattered to the host. The Lord anoints, not merely provides for, not merely protects, but honors, welcomes with oil, sets before you a cup that is not measured out sparingly. My cup runneth over. He said this last part slowly, feeling the fullness of it, the extravagance of it, the way abundance beyond necessity is its own kind of tenderness. Not a cup filled to the brim with careful precision, a cup that runs over, that cannot contain what is being poured into it, that spills generously, wastefully, the way a joyful host pours when there is more than enough, and he wants you to know there is more than enough. David was quiet after that. The fire breathed. An ember shifted and settled with a soft sound. One of the sheep near him let out a slow breath, long and easy, and was still again. The hills were dark all around, and the air was cool, and he was a boy alone on a hillside with a small fire and a flock. And somehow he was also a guest at a table, and somehow the cup before him was running over. And it was all true at once, both the hillside and the table, both the shepherd boy and the beloved guest. And the one who held all of it together was the shepherd above all shepherds. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. Follow. He thought about that word, not just accompany, not just occasionally appear. Follow, as though goodness and mercy were themselves keeping watch behind him on the path, as though they were attendants who had been assigned to him by the shepherd and would not leave his road. All the days, not the good days only, not the days when the pasture was green and the water was still and the sun was warm on his back. All of them. The cold days and the long days and the days when he was tired before morning. Goodness and mercy following him through everyone. And I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Forever. The word settled over him like something warm and very large, too large to hold entirely. Something you could only rest inside rather than contain. The house of the Lord. Home, finally, and permanently, and without the anxiety of a guest who wonders how long the welcome lasts. He would dwell there, not visit, dwell. The shepherd leads the sheep through every valley, beside every still water, through every deep shadow, and the road ends at home. He let the last words rest in the air above the embers. Goodness and mercy, following, all the days of my life. And for a little while he simply breathed, and the sheep breathed with him, and the fire settled lower, and the night held them all without effort. And then, because the night was clear and there was nothing left to ask of it, He leaned his head back against the stone and looked up. The moon had risen while he was singing. It stood low over the eastern hills, not full but generous, laying a thin silver wash across the slopes so that the sheep glowed faintly, like small clouds come down to rest on the grass. And above the moon, and around it, and out to every horizon, the stars. He had seen them every clear night of his life, and still they did it to him. That slow opening in the chest, that hush. There were more of them than any man could count. There were more of them than all the sheep and all the flocks in all the world, and every one of them stayed exactly where it had been set, moving together through the dark, like a flock that has never once been lost. When I consider thy heavens, he said softly, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars, which thou hast ordained. Fingers. That was the wonder of it. Not the arm of God, not the mighty hand that shook mountains. Fingers. The way a craftsman works when the work is delicate and dear to him. The whole enormous sky hum with that kind of care. He lay back a little further against the stone and let himself feel how small he was beneath it. It wasn't a frightening smallness. It was the smallness of a child in a great house who knows every room of it is home. What is man, that thou art mindful of him? He murmured. And the Son of Man, that thou visitest him? That was the question the stars always asked him, and it never arrived with any bitterness. It arrived like this, on a slow breath, halfway to laughter and halfway to tears. All of that, the moon, the wheeling stars, the deep and endless dark between them, and the one who made it was mindful of a boy on a hillside, not aware of him the way a king is dimly aware that he has subjects, mindful, visiting, bending near, tonight, to this fire, these sheep, this small watcher in the grass. For thou hast made him a little lower than the angels, the psalm went on inside him, and hast crowned him with glory and honor. Thou madest him to have dominion over the works of thy hands. Thou hast put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, yea, and the beasts of the field, all sheep. He almost smiled at that, there in the dark. Of all the works of God's hands, the psalm had thought to mention sheep, as if the maker of the moon and the stars knew exactly what a boy on a hillside would be looking at when the words found him. The flock breathed around him, given into his keeping, and he was kept in his turn. And above them all the heavens went on turning, the work of those careful fingers, ordained and hung and held. O Lord, our Lord, he whispered, how excellent is thy name in all the earth. He looked at his hands again. The moonlight lay across them, these hands that God had made, this particular shape that had been formed in the making of one person and no other, set into the world with the same intention that had set the stars. No crown adorned him, neither the priestly office nor the gift of prophecy belonged to him, nor any of the greatness that someone in the valley below would have thought to mention. He was a boy keeping his father's sheep on a hillside in the dark. And yet the name that was written across the stars was also written across him, across these hands, across this particular life. How excellent is thy name in all the earth. In all the earth meant this earth too, this hillside, this quiet corner of the night where no one who mattered would think to look. The sheep moved in their sleep, their wool catching the pale light. He had known these animals since he was small enough that their backs were level with his head. He had delivered the lambs that were now nearly full grown. He had searched the ravines for the ones that wandered, had carried them back to the fold with their weight across his shoulders, their small hearts beating against his chest. The work had shaped his arms and his back, had given him the sureness of movement that came from knowing the terrain in all seasons, in all weathers. There was a dignity in this work that the world did not name as such. The shepherds in the great cities, if there were such things, would be thought to hold some rank, some position of consequence. But here, in this small corner of a small land, keeping of sheep was the labor assigned to the youngest, to the least regarded member of a household. It was the work that required no special skill, no education, no connection to the important affairs of men. And yet it was also the work most like the work described in the Psalms, the work that had occupied the faithful in ages past. He thought of the stories his father had told him, the tales of the ancestors who had watched flocks in darkness, who had seen wonders and received promises. The knowledge came to him in fragments, in the evenings when the work was done and they sat by the fire. His father was not a man given to much speaking, but when he did speak of the old times, his voice took on a different quality, as if he were drawing from a well deeper than his own memory. These men, the fathers and grandfathers, had also stood in the dark with sheep. They had also felt the weight of the night sky above them, and some of them had been called to greater things, had been drawn up from their ordinary labors into the service of God in ways that changed the history of their people. The possibility of such a calling was so remote as to seem almost ridiculous, and yet it was not impossible. The stories themselves testified to this. God had not chosen men from the cities and the courts alone. He had looked into the wilderness and found men there. He had taken them from their flocks and their fields and set them into positions of great responsibility. The pattern was written into the history of the people. It was not something that happened often, but it had happened. And who could say that it would not happen again? Who could presume to know the mind of God in such matters? He turned the words over in his mind, the words of the psalm. How excellent is thy name in all the earth. The excellence was not dependent upon where the name was spoken, or by whom, or in what circumstances. The excellence was inherent in the name itself, in the reality that the name represented, whether it was spoken in a temple by priests in their formal robes, or whether it was spoken here on a hillside by a boy with dirt under his fingernails and sheepwool on his clothes. The words carried the same weight, the same truth. The God who had made the stars had also made this hillside. The same power that had ordered the heavens had also ordered the grass and the rocks and the paths that the sheep followed. Nothing was too small for God's attention. Nothing was too insignificant to be part of his design. This was a revelation that came to him in moments, not as something he had been taught in words, but as something he perceived through the senses and the understanding together. The night sky spoke it. The weight of the air spoke it. The breathing of the animals around him spoke it. He was part of a world that was utterly ordered and utterly known. A world in which every particular thing had its place and its meaning. To be a boy on a hillside in the dark was not to be excluded from this meaning. It was to be included in it, to participate in it, to be a necessary part of the vast and intricate design. The thought brought with it a deep kind of peace. If his life mattered, if this hillside mattered, if his hands and his particular existence mattered to God, then nothing done here in the dark was ever wasted. No one was watching, and yet everything was held in view. Not the hard gaze of a judge, but the patient, unhurried gaze of a keeper, the same way he himself watched over the flock without the flock ever needing to know it. The small faithful things, the water found, the lamb carried, the long quiet hours, all of it was seen, and all of it was gathered up into the great order of things, and that order was gentle. There is a kind of quiet that comes very late in the night that is different from the quiet of early evening. A quieter quiet, something that has gone down past thought. David felt it settle over him the way a cloak settles when you stop moving. Not all at once, but gradually, each fold finding its place until the whole weight of it is simply there, present and still. A few moments before, his eyes had been wide with the stars, his mind reaching outward and upward into that vast dark country of sky and light. But something had shifted now. The reaching had stopped on its own, the way a wave eventually stops traveling and simply becomes part of the shore. His gaze came down from the heavens. He looked at his flock. He looked at the low fire. He looked at his own hands resting open in his lap. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. That was the thing he noticed. He wasn't searching the darkness for a sound that shouldn't be there. He wasn't turning over a worry or rehearsing some fear about tomorrow. He wasn't asking himself any of the questions a young man asks himself when the night grows long and the mind grows loud. He was simply here. The night was simply here. The sheep were warm and breathing and close, and that was, somehow, entirely enough. There is a word for this kind of stillness, but it is not a word that can be arrived at by effort. It is not something you can decide to feel or work yourself toward. It comes on its own. It comes only when the striving has stopped, when the soul has put down whatever it was carrying and simply rested its hands at its sides. David had known other kinds of quiet on this hillside. The sharp, alert quiet of a man listening for danger. The hollow quiet of loneliness when the hours stretch too long. The restless quiet that is really only noise moving inward. This was none of those. This was something else. This was the quiet of a thing that had been settled. He thought, without quite meaning to, of a young child. Not a newborn, not an infant crying for milk. He had seen those, small and urgent, the whole body trembling with need, but an older child, a weaned child, one who had already been fed and no longer hungered, one who rested against the mother, not because it needed something from her in that moment, but simply because she was there, and her presence was the whole point. He had watched his own mother hold his younger brother that way once, the child's cheek against her shoulder, eyes half closed, one small hand loose and open, not holding on, not reaching, not working at anything at all. The child's face had been so completely at rest that it had looked like a different thing entirely from the face of a child who wants something. That face, that was what he was reaching for in his mind, without quite having the words for it yet. "Surely I have behaved and quieted myself," he murmured. The words felt less like a declaration and more like something he was discovering as he said it. The way you discover the name of a color you have always seen but never been able to name. As a child that is weaned of his mother, my soul is even as a weaned child. He turned the image over gently. The child does not ask why the mother is holding it. The child does not present its case or make an argument for why it deserves to be held. The child does not examine the quality of the holding or wonder if a different kind of mother might hold it better. The child simply rests. This was because resting is the whole truth of the moment. This was because the one who holds is enough. This was because being held is the beginning and the end of what the child needs to understand tonight. The child has stopped straining towards something just beyond its reach. It has come home to what is already here. This was what the quiet was. It was his soul having done the same thing. He had spent time under those stars wondering. The great question over, what is man that thou art mindful of him? And it was a good question, a question worth sitting with for a long while. But there is a place past the questions. He had arrived at it now without taking a single deliberate step. The question had done its work and dissolved. What remained was not an answer exactly, but something quieter and more complete than any answer. The awareness, simply, of being held, of being known, of resting in something that did not require him to understand it in order for it to be true. The fire had gone down a little more. He could feel the air on his face now, the cool that comes after midnight when the hills release the last of the day's warmth. One of the sheep shifted, settled again. The coals breathed their slow orange breath. Somewhere very far away, a single bird called once and was quiet. He didn't pray in any formal sense. He didn't arrange his thoughts into a petition or even a praise. He simply sat, and his sitting was itself a kind of acknowledgement, a way of saying without words that he was here, and God was here, and the night was wide and good, and he had no argument with any of it. His soul was quiet, not the quiet of a man who has grown out of things to say, but the quiet of a man who has, for this hour, stopped needing anything more than what is already present. He was not asking for anything tonight. That itself felt like a gift, to sit here with his flock breathing softly around him, needing nothing, resting in the one who held him, as a small child rests without wondering why. Sometime in the middle of the night, when the fire had burned down to a bed of orange coals, he found himself looking out across the hills, tracing their shapes against the sky, the way they rose and fell like the breathing of something very ancient and very large. He had grown up among these hills. He knew their names, their moods, the way they changed color in the first light of morning, and the way they turned to shadow in the late afternoon. He knew which slopes held grass longest into the dry season, and which faces caught the first rain when the rains finally came. These hills were as familiar to him as his own hands, as the sound of his own breathing in the dark. And yet tonight, coming out of that deep stillness he had just been resting in, coming slowly back to the awareness of the world around him, he looked at them differently. He looked at them the way you look at something you have always known but have never quite seen. There were people in the villages below who spoke of the hills with a kind of reverence. He had heard it in the way older men talked, the way they lifted their eyes toward the ridgelines when they needed to feel steadied, when the news was bad or the harvest was uncertain or the future felt unstable. The hills endured. The hills had been there before the oldest grandfather anyone could remember, and they would be there long after. There was comfort in that, or something that felt like comfort, something that came from looking at a thing that did not move, that did not shift, that was simply and solidly present. He understood the feeling. He had felt it himself, on harder nights than this one, when the darkness seemed less peaceful and the sounds in the distance were less easy to name. He had looked toward the hills then and felt something settle in him. But even as a young boy he had understood, in some quiet place beneath understanding, that it was not the hills themselves he was reaching toward. The hills were stone. They were old, and they were vast, and they were beautiful in the way that only ancient things are beautiful. But they could not hear him. They could not know him. They were not watching. His help did not come from the hills. He let that thought form itself slowly, the way thoughts form in the deep middle of a night when the mind is unhurried. I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. He murmured it softly, not quite aloud, feeling the shape of the words. My help cometh from the Lord, which made heaven and earth. That was the thing. That was what the hills themselves pointed toward, without knowing it. The hills were made. Someone had made them. Someone older than stone. Older than the first morning when the first light fell on these ridges, and the first shadow pooled in these valleys. The hills were not the source. The hills were a finger pointing toward the source. He looked at them now with a kind of affection, and without any of the confusion that came from asking them for something they could not give. They were simply hills. They were the work of hands far greater than anything he could imagine. And because of that they were, in their way, a kind of comfort after all, not in themselves, but because every time he looked at them, he could think of the one who had set them here. The night was very quiet. One of the sheep shifted and resettled and was still again. The coals breathed their faint orange warmth. He was cold enough now to feel it, the particular cold of a hillside in the hours past midnight, and he drew his outer garment a little closer and stayed where he was, watching. He thought about watching, about what it meant to keep watch through a long night. He had done it many times. He knew the particular discipline of it, the way the eyelids grew heavy sometime past the middle of the night, and how you had to find something to hold your attention, some task for the eyes, or the warmth and the stillness would pull you down. He knew how vulnerable a sleeping shepherd was, not to any specific danger he could name on a night as peaceful as this one, but simply vulnerable in principle. A sleeping shepherd was a flock without a watcher, and a flock without a watcher was a flock that was, in some essential way, alone. He that keepeth thee will not slumber. The words came to him softly, the way the best thoughts come, not forced but found. He turned them over in his mind. Will not slumber, not cannot slumber, not a limitation, not a weakness that had been overcome. Will not. There was something active in that word, something that spoke of intention rather than inability. He that keepeth Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. He considered this for a long moment, watching the coals. He was the watcher tonight. He was the one who had to stay awake while the sheep slept, because they depended on his wakefulness. But he himself was being watched, not by the hills, not by the stars, though they were very numerous and very steady overhead. He was being watched by the one who had made the hills and set the stars in their places, and that one did not sleep. Not tonight, not any night, not in the way that he, a young shepherd boy with heavy eyelids and a cooling fire, would need to sleep before long. There was something almost tender in the thought. He imagined for a moment what it would mean to tend a flock and never tire, to walk every hillside in every darkness and never once need to close your eyes, to hear every sound, know every movement, miss nothing. He could not sustain that kind of vigilance. No person could, but the keeper above him sustained it without effort, without cost, because tiredness was not part of what the keeper was. Behold, he that keepeth Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. And because that was true, he himself did not have to grip the night quite so tightly. This was the thought that came to him slowly, settling into him the way warmth settles into cold hands held near a fire. He could not watch forever. He would need to sleep, and when he slept, the flock would still be held, not by his wakefulness, because his wakefulness would be gone, but by the wakefulness of the one who kept him as well as the sheep, who kept the whole dark hillside and the valley below, and the roads that wound between the villages and the small fires burning in the distance. Everything was held. Everything was watched. The darkness was not empty. It was full of a presence that did not doze. The Lord is thy keeper. He let the words move through him. The Lord is thy shade upon thy right hand. The sun shall not smite thee by day, nor the moon by night. He had known hot afternoons on these hills, the kind of heat that pressed down like something solid, and he had known cold nights when the wind came off the high places and cut through everything he was wearing. He had walked through both and arrived on the other side, not because he was careful enough, or strong enough, or watchful enough, because he was kept, his going out and his coming in, every morning when he rose and led the flock out of the fold, and every evening when he brought them back, counting them through the gate, the leaving and the returning. The whole arc of every day, from beginning to end, held in something he could not see but had always, in some wordless way, known was there. The hills were still, and the stars were still, and the sheep were entirely quiet. He was cold, and he was tired, and the fire was very low, and he was, in every practical sense, alone on a dark hillside in the middle of a long night. But he was kept. He had always been kept. The hills themselves were evidence of it, not because they protected him, but because the one who made them had not stopped making, had not stopped watching, had not turned away from this particular hillside or this particular boy or this particular night that felt, right now, in the deep and holy quiet of it, like the safest place he had ever been. The Lord shall preserve thy going out and thy coming in, from this time forth, and even forevermore. And knowing that, the boy felt something loosen in his chest, some last careful vigilance he had not known he was holding, and he leaned a little more easily against the stone behind him. The fire was nearly gone now, just a low bed of coals that breathed a faint orange in the dark. The sheep had not moved in a long while. The night had reached that hour when even the insects are quiet. David didn't try to build the fire back up. There was no need. The air was cool but not cold. The wool of the nearest sheep was close enough that he could feel the small warmth of living things gathered around him. The coals gave just enough light to see by, the pale shapes of the flock, the dark outline of the hills, the vast and patient sky above. He had been awake a long time now. His eyes were beginning to feel the particular heaviness that comes not from exhaustion alone, but from a kind of fullness, the way a person feels after a long and satisfying meal, when the body wants nothing more than to be still. He had sung his way through most of the night without quite knowing he was doing it. The songs had come the way water comes from a hillside spring, not forced, not summoned by effort, but simply present, rising from whatever deep and quiet place songs rise from in a person who has spent long hours alone beneath an open sky. He had moved through pastures and still waters in his mind. He had looked up at the stars and felt himself made small and loved all at once. He had settled into a stillness so complete that even his longing had grown peaceful. And now the night had brought him to its last hour. There was one more word forming somewhere inside him. It was not a word of wondering or of praise exactly, but something closer to the ground than that. Something that had to do with sleep, trust, the particular safety of a man who knows he is not keeping himself. He thought about the nights when it hadn't felt this way. He had known those nights too. They were worth remembering, because without them this peace would not have the weight it had. There had been nights on this same hillside when the dark felt different, when sounds came out of it that made his heart move quickly and his hand tighten on the staff. When he lay awake listening and couldn't quite convince himself that everything was well. The dark had a way of pressing in on a person in those hours, filling up the spaces between things with whatever fears a person carried. He had lain on his back in the grass on such nights, and looked at the same stars he was looking at now, and felt none of what he felt tonight. The stars had seemed indifferent. The hills had seemed large and full of hidden things. But those nights had passed. Every one of them had passed, and morning had come. The flock had been whole. He had been unharmed. The fears that had seemed so close and so solid in the dark had thinned away like mist when the light came. Not because nothing could go wrong. He was not young enough in his thinking to believe that, but because something had held him through each of those nights, something that did not share his weakness, that did not flinch at the sounds in the dark, that kept watch without growing tired. He had understood this more clearly tonight than he ever had before, because he had been sitting with it for hours, turning it over the way a shepherd turns a stone in his hand, feeling the weight and the texture of it. The Lord shall preserve thy going out and thy coming in. He had sung that not long ago, or murmured it more truly, in that low voice he used when words were more for himself than for any other ear, and the truth of it had settled into him and stayed there. It was not a new truth. He had heard it spoken in the synagogue since he was a boy. But there was a difference between knowing a thing was true and knowing it in the marrow of your bones, the way a thing becomes true when you have lived long enough to feel its weight. Now another line was coming. A different one, older feeling somehow, simpler. The kind of line that has been true so long it has gone down past argument into something more like fact. I will both lay me down in peace and sleep. He said it softly. His voice was barely above a breath. The nearest sheep stirred slightly and was still again. There was a rightness to the words that had nothing to do with how beautiful they sounded or how many times they had been sung. They were right because they matched something true in the world, something true in the nature of how a man might rest when he understood that his life was held by hands larger than his own. The words were old, but they arrived new each time a person spoke them with their whole heart. For thou, Lord, only makest me dwell in safety. That was it. That was the whole of it, really. He could lay himself down, not because the hills were safe, not because the night was predictable, not because he had done everything right and there was nothing left to fear, but because the one who made heaven and earth was keeping him, keeping the flock and keeping the hillside itself. And there was nothing in the dark that the Lord had not already seen and already held within his knowledge. The safety was not in the place, it was in the presence, and the presence did not require him to stay awake to remain effective. He felt something loosening in him at that thought, some last small vigilance he had been carrying all night without knowing it. The way a person carries tension in the shoulders through a long day and only feels it release when they finally sit down. He had been awake. He had kept watch. He had done what a shepherd does. But the keeping that mattered most was not his. It had never been his, and he could lay himself down and sleep, and the flock would still be held. The thought did not make him lazy or indifferent. Instead, it freed him. It freed him to rest as he was meant to rest, to sleep as he was meant to sleep, knowing that the vigil did not depend on him alone. There was a watching that never closed. There was a presence that did not grow weary or look away, and in that presence and could finally let go of his small and insufficient strength, and simply be held. Thou hast put gladness in my heart. He had not meant to say that. It arrived on its own, the way the other lines had, rising from somewhere beneath conscious thought. But it was true. There was gladness in him tonight, a quiet gladness, nothing loud or leaping, just a low and steady warmth the way the coals in front of him held their warmth without flame. He had not earned it. He had not produced it through the right sequence of thoughts or the right length of prayer. It had simply been put there, the way a lamp is put in a room by someone who knows the room will need light, and he received it the way a room receives a lamp, without effort, without deserving, simply by being the place where the light was placed. The coals were very low now. He could see the faint shapes of the nearest animals, the curve of a back, the small round of a head tucked down into wool. They were all still, every one of them. The flock that had been restless in the early evening, that had taken time to settle, that had shifted and murmured through the cooler hours, was now entirely at rest. They trusted the hillside because they trusted the shepherd, and the shepherd was learning, again, in the way he learned it fresh each time, that he could trust the same. He let his back rest more fully against the stone behind him. The stone had held the sun's warmth all day and released it slowly through the night. What was left of it now was faint but real, a gentleness at his back, the way a hand rests gently on a shoulder without pressing, without demanding anything. The words of the psalm were still moving through him, but slowly now, without urgency. I will both lay me down in peace. The peace was not dramatic. It did not feel like anything extraordinary. It felt like what it was, the end of a long night. A boy who was very tired, a flock that was safe, a sky full of stars that had been turning slowly all night long and would go on turning. It felt like being held. His eyes were very heavy. The words of the psalm were no longer words exactly, but something warmer and slower, moving through him the way the last warmth of a fire moves through a stone long after the flames have gone. The hills were dark. The stars were turning slowly overhead. The flock breathed on, and the night went on, and he was kept. The embers settled once more, softly, like something turning over in its sleep. David's chin dipped toward his chest, and he let it, half in the night and half in some gentler country just beyond it. He stayed there by the warm stones, a boy folded into his cloak, while the psalms went on humming somewhere below his thoughts, the way water goes on moving under ice. He didn't know, and didn't need to know, all the nights that were still ahead of him. Other hillsides, other fires, psalms that hadn't found him yet. The night knew, the one who kept the night knew, and the hills lay all around him in the dark, patient as sleep itself, while the stars turned slowly on, and the story drifted onward, the way a boat drifts on quiet water long after the rowing has stopped. The years don't announce themselves. They simply accumulate, the way stone gathers moss, the way a river deepens its own bed without appearing to move. The boy on the hillside grew, and the world learned his name. The young man became a soldier, then a favorite, then a threat, and then came the years when the songs changed, when the psalms that had once been simple enough to hum over sleeping sheep became something else entirely, harder and stranger, shaped by the pressure of real darkness, real fear, by nights when safety itself had become an unfamiliar country. These were the wilderness years, the fugitive years. He came to the cave of Adullam the way a man comes to any shelter he hadn't expected to find, with relief, and with something like disbelief. The rock was cold against the hand when first he touched it, cold and real and solid, and that solidness was its own kind of grace. Inside, the cave opened wider than the entrance suggested. There was room enough to breathe, room enough to build a small fire, room enough for the men who came to join him. 400 of them eventually, men in debt and men in distress, and men whose lives had come apart at the seams, gathering around a fugitive in the dark of a hillside cave, as if nearness to him could somehow be the beginning of something new. Perhaps it could. He had seen stranger things. The fire was low now. It had been a long day, and the men were asleep, their breathing slow and even in the dark around him, the sound of it filling the low stone space the way water fills a vessel. Somewhere deeper in the cave, water dripped from the ceiling to the floor, patient and unhurried, indifferent to kings and fugitives both. The smoke rose and found its way out through some passage he had never located, and the air was bearable, and the cold was kept back, and that was enough. That was more than enough. Danger was out there, beyond the mouth of the cave, beyond the hills that folded into one another in the dark. Saul and his men were somewhere in that darkness, searching along roads and through villages, asking questions in the places where questions were not welcome. But the hills were wide and the night was deep, and inside the cave there was only the fire and the rock and the slow sound of sleeping men, and the water falling drop by drop into the dark. The threat existed the way a rumor exists, heard of, spoken of, somewhere beyond the edge of what could be seen or touched. Here now there was only this. He had been running a long time, long enough that the running had become its own kind of life, with its own rhythms and its own necessities. He knew how to move without being seen. He knew how to read a hillside for the signs of other men's passage. He knew how to be hungry, which is a thing that sounds simple but takes years to learn without breaking. And he knew how to pray, which was perhaps the oldest knowledge he carried, older than any of the rest. The Psalms had come with him through all of it. They had come the way a language comes, not as something carried, but as something spoken from the inside, something the mouth knew before the mind caught up. The simple songs of the hillside years had not disappeared, but they had deepened, the way a river deepens, the way a voice deepens after years of use, after grief, after long stretches of silence in which the things that needed saying had no other form. What had once been wonder had become something sturdier, still wonder, but the kind that has been tested, the kind that knows what it is to be afraid in the dark and to speak the name of God into that darkness and to wait, and to find, eventually, that the waiting itself was a kind of answer. He leaned back against the cave wall now, the stone rough and real against his shoulder. The fire breathed. The men breathed. The water fell somewhere in the dark, and the Psalms were there, the way they had always been there, already forming themselves in the slow country just behind his closed eyes. The cave held all of it, the fire, the fear, the long dark, and the Psalms were still there, the way they had always been there, waiting for him to find them again. He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. The words moved through the cave the way the firelight moved, slowly, touching the rough walls, finding the low ceiling, settling into the spaces between sleeping men. The fire had burned down to its quieter self. The wood was mostly coals now, orange and patient, and the darkness beyond them was the darkness of deep rock, the kind that does not shift with the wind because no wind reaches here. Water moved somewhere inside the stone, dripping at intervals, steady as a pulse. David's back was against the cave wall, his cloak folded around him, and the psalm was in him the way breath is in a man, not thought about, simply present. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God. In him will I trust. Surely he shall deliver thee from the snare of the fowler, and from the noisome pestilence. He shall cover thee with his feathers, and under his wings shalt thou trust. He had seen this in the fields as a boy, a ewe moving between her lamb and whatever threatened it, a bird dropping low over the nest, wings extended, the body becoming a roof, a wall, the shape of safety made flesh. These were not decorations on the idea of protection. They were the clearest pictures available of what protection actually felt like from the inside. Not the high wall that keeps the enemy at distance, the wing that comes close, the warmth that tells you, without explanation, that you are covered. Under his wings shalt thou trust. And here again, trust, not comprehend, not see clearly, not possess the full accounting of how deliverance would arrive or when. Trust. The cave dripped. The coals breathed softly in the dark. The men slept on, their breathing slow and even, and outside the cave the wilderness of Judah lay under its enormous sky. And somewhere in that wilderness, the danger that had driven them here was still present, still a reality, still capable of ending this particular story badly. The psalm did not pretend otherwise. It did not say the snare did not exist, that the fowler had gone home. that the noisome pestilence was someone else's concern. It said, "He shall cover thee." Present tense, present danger, present covering. His truth shall be thy shield and buckler. Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night. Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night. It is possible to read that line quickly, to absorb it as comfort and move past it without staying long enough to feel the full weight of what is being promised. But for a man who had known what the terror by night actually meant, not as metaphor, not as poetic flourish, but as a thing lived through, on nights long past and now far away, for such a man, these words did not pass quickly. They stopped him. They required him to sit with them. For he shall give his angels charge over thee. The word charge is a word of commission, of assignment, of a task formally given and seriously meant. The angels are not wandering the vicinity with general goodwill. They have been given charge. They have been told specifically, keep this one, keep him in all his ways, not in the high moments only, not in the battles already recorded and celebrated, in all his ways, in the unnamed days, in the cave nights that would leave no particular mark on history, in the hours that no one would write down, the ordinary hours between the extraordinary ones, the slow hours of a fire burning to coals while a man rested against a rough wall with nothing to recommend the moment, except that it was happening inside the promise. He shall call upon me, and I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will deliver him and honor him. With long life will I satisfy him and show him my salvation. The dripping water found its rhythm again in the cave. Somewhere a man shifted in sleep, turning onto his side, his breathing changing for a moment before it settled. The coals pulsed once, a small brightening, then returned to their low, steady glow. David's eyes were heavy, but the psalm was still moving through him. He did not try to hold it. He did not try to reason his way into its promises or construct the logical argument for why they applied to a man in his particular circumstances. He only let it move. The shadow of the Almighty was not something he could see, precisely. It was something he inhabited. The way a man inhabits warmth without seeing warmth. The way a man breathes without watching himself breathe. Under the wings. He had come back to that image again. The way a man comes back to a fire when the night is cold. The wings that were both shelter and tenderness, both fortress and nearness. The kind of protection that does not keep you at arm's length from the one protecting you, but draws you in, holds you close, makes of its own body a house. The cave was cold at its edges, where the rock reached its deep temperature and stayed there. But near the coals there was warmth, and the warmth was the kind that asked nothing of a man except that he stay near it. He stayed near it. His breathing slowed. The psalm went on beneath his thoughts, the way it always had, the way it would long after this night had passed into the long record of nights he would survive. Thou shalt not be afraid, not because the darkness is not dark, not because the wilderness has become safe, not because the men who pursue a man have turned for home, but because the one who made the darkness is present in it, because the shadow of the Almighty falls across every cave mouth, every hillside, every place where a man has run out of choices and stopped running and sat down against the rock in the dark and simply waited. The shadow was here, the wings were here, and the night was very quiet, and the men were asleep. And the water went on dripping in the stone, and nothing came through the mouth of the cave except the cold, and the cold was only cold. The wings were over him. He knew it the way a man knows warmth, and the night pressed close around the cave, but it did not press in. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? Though an host should encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. The cave dripped somewhere in its deeper reaches, a slow, irregular sound. water finding its way down through limestone, patient as anything alive and old. One of the men nearby shifted in his sleep and was still again. The fire had settled into coals, orange and breathing slowly, casting just enough light to see the rough wall across the chamber. In the time of Saul, in the years of the chase, there had been hosts. There had been armies sent with specific orders. There had been men who knew these hills, who could track a footprint across dry stone. And still, one thing have I desired of the Lord, that will I seek after. For in the time of trouble he shall hide me in his pavilion. In the secret of his tabernacle shall he hide me. When my father and my mother forsake me, then the Lord will take me up. He had been given over to the wilderness by those who should have kept him. Saul, who had been like a father to him once, who had given him a daughter and a seat at the table, had turned and become something else entirely. And still the psalm holds, even at that extreme, even when the most fundamental human bonds have given way. Even then, something holds. Something takes up what was put down. The word is tender. Take me up, like a thing lifted from the ground by careful hands. The fire breathed. A coal broke apart, and a small shower of sparks went up and faded. Outside the cave's mouth, the night was fully dark now, the kind of dark that has settled into itself completely and is no longer becoming anything but simply is. And inside the cave there was the warmth and the men and the low sound of breathing and the dripping in the deep dark. And it was enough. Not what he would have chosen, maybe. Not what had been promised. Not yet. Not this night. But the hiding was real. The pavilion was real. The one thing he had asked for was here in whatever form this night could hold it. Wait on the Lord. Be of good courage, and he shall strengthen thine heart. Wait, I say, on the Lord. One thing, only one thing, and the cave with its low fire and its dripping walls and its sleeping men was, for this night, enough. Be merciful unto me, O God, be merciful unto me, for my soul trusteth in thee. In the shadow of thy wings will I make my refuge, until these calamities be overpast. The fire in the cave had dropped lower. One of the men nearby shifted in his sleep, pulled his cloak closer, settled again. The dripping water somewhere deeper in the rock kept its slow count, patient and indifferent. The darkness beyond the cave's mouth was complete. No stars were visible from where he lay, only the rough ceiling of stone overhead and the faint orange wash of the coals on the near wall, the shadows moving slightly where the air moved. He cried unto God Most High, unto God that performeth all things for him. That phrase, that performeth all things, carries a kind of staggering scope when it is met honestly. Not some things, not the things that fall within a certain range of divine attention. All things, the great and the small, the decisive battles and the cold nights in the rock, the years of favor and the years of running, all of it, held in hands that do not lose their grip. This was not a theology arrived at easily. It was wrested out of experience the way metal is wrested out of ore, by heat, by pressure, by a process that is not comfortable to undergo. A man who has never slept on cold ground with enemies in the hills may say such words smoothly, without weight. David said them from inside the thing self, which is the only place from which they can be said with full meaning. He shall send from heaven and save me. The mercy shall be sent from above. My heart is fixed, O God, my heart is fixed. I will sing and give praise. For thy mercy is great unto the heavens, and thy truth unto the clouds. Be thou exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let thy glory be above all the earth. O God, thou art my God. Early will I seek thee. My soul thirsteth for thee. My flesh longeth for thee in a dry and thirsty land where no water is. He had been thirsty before, not the ordinary thirst of a long afternoon, not the thirst that a cup of water answers and ends. There had been days in the wilderness of Judah when the ground beneath him was pale and cracked like old pottery, when the air itself seemed to have forgotten what water was, when the back of his throat carried a dryness that no stream, when he finally found one, could entirely remove. He knew what it meant to long for water with the whole body, every movement of the limbs toward it, the mind narrowing to a single point, the way the body stops caring about anything else entirely and organizes itself around that one need, that one absence, that one direction. He had felt all of it, and so when the words came, "My soul thirsteth for thee, my flesh longeth for thee in a dry and thirsty land," they were not figures of speech to him. They were the most accurate description he had found for something that had no other language. The thirst for God was a thirst the body remembered. It moved through the same channels. It pressed with the same insistence. The wilderness of Judah is not a gentle place. It drops sharply east from the hill country toward the Dead Sea, and as it drops, it dries. The rock turns pale. The vegetation thins and disappears. The silence becomes a different kind of silence, not peaceful, but empty, vast, indifferent to whatever small human thing moves through it. David had moved through it more than once. The land does not care. That is the particular quality of wilderness. It does not care whether a man lives or dies within it. It simply extends, pale and severe, in every direction. And yet this was where the psalm had found him. Not in the palace, not in the beauty of the sanctuary, though the psalm would speak of that too. The power and the glory seen as in a holy place. It found him in the dry land, in the empty land, in the land where no water is. Perhaps that is where these things always find a man, when the ordinary satisfactions are stripped away, when there is no comfort close enough to reach for, when the familiar props of a settled life are gone, then the deeper thirst becomes impossible to ignore. It rises, it insists, it makes itself known in a way it never quite can when there are easier things within reach. The fire in the cave had settled lower. His back was against the cave wall and his knees were drawn up, and his eyes were more closed than open. The psalm moved through him the way breath moves through a sleeping man, without effort, without will, simply continuing because it knows the way. My soul thirsteth for thee. He did not have to try to mean it. He had been running long enough to mean it without trying. Because thy loving kindness is better than life. That line arrives slowly, the way a very certain thing arrives, not as an argument, not as a declaration requiring proof, but as something a man finds himself knowing after enough years have worn away the alternatives. Life had offered him many things. It had offered him a place in the king's court and a king's daughter, and the sound of the people singing his name in the streets after Goliath fell. It had offered him friendship of the kind that most men never find, the kind that Jonathan had given him, selfless and clear-eyed and costly. And then life had taken most of those things back, one by one, or scattered them, or made them unreachable. What remained when the rest had been reduced? The loving kindness of God remained, better than life. The psalm did not say better than bad circumstances. It said better than life itself. That is a larger claim. That is the claim of a man who has looked at life steadily and is still saying it. Thus will I bless thee while I live. The fire was low. He was a fugitive with a price on his life and men sleeping around him who had come to him because they too had nowhere else to go. And the psalm was praise. That was the recurring strangeness of it. Not that he prayed in such places, Not that he cried out, but that he praised. That in the wilderness and in the cave and in the night, something rose in him that was not complaint and not petition but gratitude, astonishment, the lifting of the hands even when the hands were empty. My soul shall be satisfied as with marrow and fatness. He did not know where that image had first come to him, the satisfaction of marrow, the richness of it, the way certain nourishment goes deep into a man's body and stays there. He had known hunger in the wilderness. The body's hunger is a specific and educational thing. It teaches a man what he is made of, what his actual requirements are, how far he can go on very little. But the psalm was not speaking about the body's hunger only. It was speaking about the deeper hunger, the one that remains even when the body is fed, the one that certain kinds of abundance never touch. The soul satisfied as with marrow and fatness, not as with bread, not as with water, but as with the richest thing, the thing at the center of the bone. That was the satisfaction the psalm promised, and he had known it. Not always, not continuously, but in moments scattered through the years like stones in a dry stream bed. He had known it. It was enough to keep a man going, more than enough. When I remember thee upon my bed, and meditate on thee in the night watches. The night watches were the hours between midnight and morning, the slow hours, the hours when the mind moves differently than it moves in daylight. He was in them now, or near enough. The fire was almost nothing. The cave was almost entirely dark. The men around him were breathing in the long rhythms of deep sleep, and he was between waking and sleeping, neither fully one thing nor fully the other, in that country where a man cannot control what he thinks but only watch what arrives. What arrived was the remembering, not the danger, not the pursuit, not the face of Saul, or the names of the men who had been sent. What arrived was older than any of that, the goodness seen in years before this one. The moments when God had been unmistakable, closer than the sound of his own breathing. He followed after God with everything he had, and the night watch passed slowly over him, and the darkness in the cave was not empty. Because thou hast been my help, therefore in the shadow of thy wings will I rejoice. The shadow of thy wings. That image again, the same image as before, as if the night kept returning to it, as if it needed to be said more than once, as if once was not enough to cover what it meant. He had said it in the cave, written it in the cave, and now the cave held him while he said it again, while he let it move through him in the half-dark, in the slow hours, in the place between sleep and waking where the words go quieter but do not stop. The rock was solid behind his shoulder. The darkness was complete now except for the last orange thread of the fire. The men slept. The night went on. His eyes were closed, and in the night watches the remembering went on by itself, gentle and unhurried, the way a river goes on moving after the wind has stopped. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore will not we fear, though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea. He had seen the hills dark. He had seen the sky go strange before storms. He had run through terrain that shifted under him, loose rock and sudden drop, the body never certain of what ground would hold. A fugitive learns the ground differently than other men. Every hillside becomes a question. Every shadow holds a possible answer that the man running does not want to hear. But this was the claim of the psalm, laid quietly against all of that even the mountains falling did not constitute a final argument, that beneath the catastrophe there was something that did not move, and there was the river. A river, in the middle of the shaking, a river, not a fortress only, not a hiding place, not merely the cessation of danger, but gladness, streams making glad. The city of God set not in stillness exactly, but in the path of something living, something moving through it with a sound like abundance. The image refuses to be only defensive. It insists on joy. It insists that the life inside the refuge is not merely survival, but something richer, something watered and green and glad, even while the earth outside is carried into the sea. God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God shall help her in that right early. He maketh wars to cease unto the end of the earth. He breaketh the bow, and cutteth the spear in sunder. He burneth the chariot in the fire. The war would cease, not because the men pursuing him would grow weary, or because the political winds would shift, though both of those things would eventually be true. It would cease because there was one who stood at the far end of all conflict and dismantled it, who broke the instruments of it, who burned what had been built for destruction. The cave held men who had come from war, who carried its memory in their bodies, who slept with the particular heaviness of those who have been afraid for a long time. But the psalm said the bow would be broken, said it plainly, without apology. Be still, and know that I am God. Be still. The cave required nothing else. The dark beyond the cave mouth was the same dark it had been for hours, patient, neither pressing in nor drawing back. The water moved somewhere in the rock, the fire breathed, and the knowing was not an act of study or of effort, but simply what remained when all the motion had finally stopped. The sense of something holding, something underneath the underneath. The very present help, present now, present in the dark, present in the rock, present in the warmth of men sleeping near one another in a place they had not chosen, but had been given. Be still. And the cave was still, and the fire was still, and the men were still, and something larger than any of them held the night in its hands without effort. Truly my soul waiteth upon God. From him cometh my salvation. He only is my rock and my salvation. He is my defense. I shall not be greatly moved. My soul, wait thou only upon God, for my expectation is from him. He is my rock and my salvation. He is my defense. I shall not be moved. The fire shifted. One of the coals broke apart softly in the dark. For a moment there was a brief brightening, a pulse of orange against the low ceiling of the cave, and then it subsided. The dark was deeper than before, not threatening, just deep, the kind of deep that the psalm had already accounted for. Power belongeth unto God. Also unto thee, O Lord, belongeth mercy. He did not know, lying there against the stone with his cloak pulled close, all the nights that were still to come. He did not know the years that would pass before the turning came. He did not know the psalms that had not yet found him, the words that would only be possible after losses he hadn't yet suffered. He knew this night. He knew this cave. He knew the rock at his back and the low coals and the breathing of the men and the dark pressing gently at everything. He knew the psalm that was still moving through him, slower now, quieter, the way water slows when it reaches deeper ground. My soul, wait thou only upon God. He was very nearly asleep. The cave held him. The dark held the cave. Above the cave, the night sky turned in its ancient circuit, the stars indifferent to the smallness of what lay beneath them, and yet somehow not indifferent. The psalm said so. The rock held. The wings, he had fallen asleep under the wings more than once on hillsides much colder than this. He had always woken. The morning had always come, and the one who kept him had not slept. He only. The words went on somewhere below sleep, below the dying fire, below the dark weight of the cave. He only. The night deepened, and the wings were still there, and the rock held, and the story went on. Many years separate that cave from this corridor. Decades of campaigns and betrayals and coronations and funerals and children and the particular grief of outliving the wrong ones. The stone floor of the palace was cold in a way that reminded him of something, not unpleasantly. He moved through the outer hall without a lamp because he did not need one. He had learned the dimensions of this place the way the body learns things it will not easily unlearn. The servants slept. The guards stood where they always stood. The city below the walls made no sound that troubled anything. He was old. This was not a thing he resisted anymore. The body had made its terms clear, and he had come to a kind of peace with those terms. What surprised him, in these late years, was not how much had been lost. Loss had been his teacher for a very long time. What surprised him was what remained. Not the power, not the armies, not the architecture of the kingdom. Those things were Solomon's now, or they would be. What remained was the songs. They were still in him, every one of them, not recited, present. The way a language learned young remains present even after the country is gone. He had written some of them in places he would never choose to return to. The cave at Adullam, the wilderness beyond the Jordan when Absalom had turned the city against him, the long years when Saul's spears made every hall feel like a narrowing. Those songs had not come from comfort. They had come from the place below comfort, from the ground beneath the ground, where a man discovers what he is built on when everything built on top has been stripped away. He did not idealize those years. They had been what they were, desperate, cold, uncertain mornings following uncertain nights, but something had been formed in them that nothing since had dissolved, a knowledge, not theological in the way scholars meant when they discussed such things, but bodily, the way a scar is knowledge. The knowledge that the dark had never once been empty. This is what he turned over now, walking the corridor slowly so as not to wake the servants, not reviewing his life as a general reviews a campaign, looking for the decisions that might have gone otherwise. Something quieter than that, more like a man lifting stones in a riverbed, not searching for anything in particular, simply attending to what lived beneath. Each song, as he recalled it, carried with it the particular quality of the night it had been given to him. Not the circumstances only, but the temperature of the darkness, the texture of whatever surface he had pressed his back against, the precise register of the fear or the grief that had driven the words up and out of him before he fully understood what he was saying. He passed the doorway that opened onto the upper terrace and stopped there. The night air came in. Jerusalem lay below him in the dark, breathing slowly, 10,000 lives in their 10,000 rooms, most of them asleep. The stars were where they had always been. He had known those particular arrangements of light since he was a boy on the hills outside Bethlehem, lying in the grass with his cloak open, watching the sky with the untroubled attention that belongs to the young and the undamaged. He had watched the same stars from the cave. He was watching them now. They did not appear to have changed their opinion of him. This was also, he thought, a kind of mercy. The psalm came to him, the way they often came in these late hours, not summoned, simply present, the way a smell carries you somewhere before you have decided to go. How amiable are thy tabernacles! The longing that lived in that line was not sentimental. It was specific. It had a history. He had spent years unable to draw near to the place of worship, years when the ark was elsewhere, years when he was elsewhere, years when the distance between where he was and where the presence of God rested felt less like geography and more like the kind of distance a man carries inside himself after a particular kind of failure. Even the birds had found a place. That was the line that had always reached him most quietly, without announcement. Even the sparrow, even the swallow, small and quick and unremarkable, nesting in the eaves of the altar itself, her young warm in a place built for the holy. There was something in that image that he had never been able to fully explain, and had long since stopped trying to explain. He was very old now, and Jerusalem was quiet, and somewhere in the city a lamp was still burning, and he had been thinking about sparrows. The psalm he had always loved most was the one about the sparrows. He had not always known why. There were psalms of greater power, psalms that shook the frame of heaven with their urgency, psalms that reached the floor of the deepest grief and came back with something. But this one had always settled into him differently, quietly, the way a hand settles onto a shoulder in the dark. How amiable are thy tabernacles, O Lord of hosts. He had written those words, or received them. The line between those two things had long since blurred for him. And even now, walking slowly along the edge of the upper parapet with the city spread dark below him, they moved through his body the way warmth moves through old stone. Slowly, deeply, as though they had always been there. The tabernacles. He knew what it was to long for them. Not abstractly, not the way a man longs for something he has only imagined. He knew the specific, physical ache of a man who has been removed from the place of worship and cannot return. He had spent years in the wilderness, unable to approach the ark. Years when the rituals of the sanctuary were something other men performed while he slept in ravines and ate what he could find and kept his fire small so the smoke would not betray him. There were nights during those years when the longing for the tabernacle was indistinguishable from any other kind of hunger. It sat in the same place. It demanded in the same way. It did not become philosophical or refined. It was simply want, acute and wordless and constant. This is what the psalm carries that sentiment cannot. It carries the weight of actual absence. My soul longeth, yea, even fainteth for the courts of the Lord. The word fainteth is not decorative. It is the word of a man who has gone without long enough that his legs are beginning to fail him. His heart and his flesh crieth out for the living God. Both, not the mind reaching upward in composed devotion, but the whole body calling out the way a body calls out when it has been too long in the cold. This psalm was not written by a man sitting comfortably in the courts. It was written by a man standing outside them, remembering. And then the birds. This was the part that had always stopped him. Even the sparrow hath found a house, and the swallow a nest for herself, where she may lay her young, even thine altars, O Lord of hosts, my King and my God. He had thought about this image more times than he could count. The sparrow, the swallow, ordinary birds, not the eagle in his strength, not the stork with her dignity, not any creature that might plausibly represent sacred things. The sparrow, which was the smallest coin of the bird world, worth almost nothing, sold in pairs for a price that barely registered, and the swallow, which was simply domestic, a creature of nests and mud and the careful arrangement of small materials into something that would hold. These birds had found their way to the altars, to the altar itself, the holiest place, the place where the distance between the human and the divine was meant to be addressed, and there they nested, unbothered, domestic, going about the ordinary business of making a home in the holiest place imaginable, and the text does not suggest anyone drove them away. The Lord of hosts permitted it. My King and my God looked at the sparrow in her nest among the altars and did not object. There is something in this that exceeds what doctrine can easily hold. The sacred place, rather than expelling the ordinary, became home to it. The bird that built her nest beside the place of sacrifice was as settled there as any priest, more settled perhaps because she had not been told to fear. He understood this differently now than he had when he first received the image. When he was young, The sanctuary had felt large and luminous to him, a place of overwhelming weight. He had approached the ark with awe that was nearly terror. He had leaped before it in an ecstasy that embarrassed his household. The presence of God had not been small to him, had never been small. But neither, it turned out, had it been exclusive. The bird did not know to be afraid of altars. The bird simply found a good place to build, a solid place, a place where the structure would hold, and the structure held. The ark had not always had a structure. He knew this. It had traveled in a tent, moved from place to place, carried on poles through the wilderness, given shelter by curtains rather than walls. There had been years when the ark itself was without a permanent home, kept in various houses, resting in Kiriath-Jearim for 20 years, while Israel mourned and the presence of God waited with a patience that shamed human urgency. He had wanted to build a house for it. He had told Nathan so, and it had seemed so obvious, so right. The ark was in curtains while he lived in cedar. Something was wrong with that arithmetic. And Nathan had come back the next morning with a word that rearranged everything. God would build him a house. He would not build God one. He had taken years to fully understand the mercy in that answer. God did not need what David could construct. What David needed, God would provide. The house would outlast the builder. The covenant would outlast the cedar. And the longing itself, this psalm, this ache, this faintness at the threshold of worship, was not a problem to be solved by construction. It was a posture. It was the posture of a creature who knows what it was made for and cannot be at rest anywhere else. Yea, the sparrow hath found a house, the swallow, a nest, where she may lay her young. That phrase had returned to him many times in the years since his children began dying. Absalom, the infant who had not survived 8 days. Others. He had laid them in the ground and kept walking because there was no alternative to keeping walking. But the swallow laid her young at the altars, and they were safe there, in the holy place, in the presence of the keeper. He had decided, at some point in the long middle of his life, to believe this about the ones he had lost. He did not know precisely what it meant. He held it carefully, the way you hold something that might not survive being gripped too tightly. But he held it. Blessed is the man whose strength is in thee, not whose strength is adequate to the task, not whose strength has been refined by suffering into something sufficient, whose strength is in thee, the location of strength, not the quantity of it. He had spent the first half of his life building his own strength into something formidable, and the second half discovering that it was not the thing doing the real work. The real work was done from somewhere he had not built and could not maintain. He had only to keep going toward the source. In whose heart are the ways of them, who passing through the valley of Baca make it a well, the valley of weeping. He had passed through it more than once. Everyone does. The question is only whether you carry the water out or leave it standing. Behold, O God, our shield, and look upon the face of thine anointed. He had been the anointed once, a boy with oil still drying on his forehead, not understanding what was beginning. He was old now. The anointing had not expired. That was the thing about being chosen by the living God. The choice did not have a term limit. It ran the length of the life and then turned a corner he had not yet seen around. For a day in thy courts is better than 1,000. He had done the arithmetic. He had lived enough days now to know what 1,000 felt like, to know what a day in the courts felt like, and the psalm was not exaggerating. It was simply precise. I had rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than to dwell in the tents of wickedness. He had said this, and meant it, and then gone on to acquire tents and palaces and everything a king could acquire. And it was still true, all of it in one hand, and one day at the threshold in the other, and the threshold outweighed everything. This was not poetry. This was a man who had stood at both and reported back honestly. For the Lord God is a sun and shield. The Lord will give grace and glory. No good thing will he withhold from them that walk uprightly. He leaned against the stone of the parapet and felt the night air move across the city below. The lamps had mostly gone dark. The streets were empty. Jerusalem breathed slowly in its sleep, and the psalm was still moving through him, the way it always moved through him, not passing but settling, finding the places in him that recognized it. The city lay below him, dark and breathing, and he thought, a day in thy courts, just one day, and everything else recedes. He had made a habit, in his old age, of counting things before sleep, not possessions, not territories, not the names of enemies outlasted or battles survived, though those lists existed too, written somewhere in him in permanent ink. What he counted now, in the quiet hours when Jerusalem was still and the lamp had burned down to its last reliable inch of light, was mercies. A mercy from 40 years ago, a mercy from last week, a morning he had woken expecting nothing and been given more than he could carry. And somewhere in the counting, without any particular announcement, sleep would come. The habit had simply grown in him the way certain things grow in old men, slowly, without urgency, and then so thoroughly that you could not imagine being without it. The psalm had grown in him the same way. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits. He had written it. But writing a thing and knowing a thing are not always the same arrival, and the knowing had taken longer than the writing. The word that had lodged deepest was not bless, it was forget not. Two words carrying the whole weight of the psalm's intention, because the natural movement of memory is not toward gratitude. The natural movement is toward accumulation of injury, toward the slow cataloging of what went wrong, and who was responsible and what might have been different. Gratitude requires effort. It requires turning the memory deliberately, like turning a stone in a stream, until the light catches what is underneath. Forget not. He knew this tendency. He had spent portions of his life entirely in its grip. Who forgiveth all thine iniquities? He let this one sit without rushing past it, the way you let a thing settle that is too large to be quickly processed. Forgiven, not overlooked, not deferred, not held at a careful distance. Forgiven, which is a different and more complete word. There were iniquities in his history that he would not rehearse by name in the dark, not because he had forgotten them, but because the forgiveness had been specific and real. And to name the sin now would be to drag it back into a room it had been removed from. Nathan had stood before him and said, "The Lord hath put away thy sin," put away, moved, relocated to somewhere it no longer governed. He had not deserved this. The psalm did not require him to. It simply named the mercy and asked the soul not to forget it. He did not forget it. It was, in some ways, the mercy around which all the other mercies arranged themselves, the one that made the others legible. Who healeth all thy diseases? He had interpreted this narrowly once, as a young man, as a promise about the body. He understood it differently now. The diseases that God had healed in him were not only the ones that showed in the flesh, though there had been those as well. Fevers broken, wounds that should have festered and did not. The deeper healings had been interior, grief that had compacted in him like stone after the infant died. He had written a psalm in the middle of that grief, a psalm that was mostly just crying, and somewhere in the writing the stone had begun, slowly, almost imperceptibly, to soften, not disappear, soften. The grief had not been removed, but it had been made survivable, and then livable, and then eventually a thing he could carry without it carrying him. He led that healing. He was not certain what else to call it. Absalom. He let the name come, as it sometimes came, without trying to stop it. His son. His beautiful and treacherous son who had driven him out of Jerusalem and then died in a forest in a way that even now, years later, the old man found his throat tightening to remember. "Oh, my son Absalom, my son, my son." He had said it over and over at the gate until Joab came and told him, with Joab's particular bluntness, that he was shaming the men who had just saved his life. And he had known Joab was right, and it had made no difference at all, because there is a kind of grief that the correct argument cannot touch. That grief had been healed too, not resolved, not explained, but he was standing here, old, in a quiet palace, alive, which meant the grief had not, in the end, consumed him. He was healed of the consuming part. Who healeth all thy diseases? Who redeemeth thy life from destruction? How many times? Saul and the spear, the cave at Adullam, where he had hidden with the men who came to him broken, and somehow out of that brokenness a company of the faithful had been made. The moments in the wilderness when the path had simply closed off behind him and opened in front of him, and there was no explanation but the one the psalm offered. He redeemeth thy life from destruction. Not randomly, not incidentally. Redeems it, which is a word that implies purchase, implies cost, implies that the deliverance was not free even if the recipient paid nothing. Who crowneth thee with loving kindness and tender mercies? The word crowneth. He had worn a crown most of his life and knew something about what a crown was. A circle of weight placed on a head, visible from a distance, marking the one who wore it as belonging to a particular office. And the psalm said that what circled his head, what marked him from above, was loving kindness, tender mercies. The thing that God placed on him, the thing that defined what he was and where he belonged, was mercy. He had not always understood this. He had confused the crown of gold for the thing itself. It was not the thing itself. Who satisfieth thy mouth with good things, so that thy youth is renewed like the eagles. He understood renewal now in a way that youth does not permit. There were mornings when he woke with something in him that the night before had not been there. An aliveness, a readiness, a sense that the day ahead was worth moving toward. Not restored youth, something better, the same life made strong again within itself. The eagle does not become a fledgling. It molts, it struggles, and then it rises on the same wings, stronger than before the difficulty. This was the renewal the psalm promised, not replacement, renovation of what already was. Like as a father pitieth his children, so the Lord pitieth them that fear him. He had been a father. He understood pitying a child, that particular tenderness that has nothing to do with the child's behavior and everything to do with the child's vulnerability. A child falls and you feel it in your own body before you move to help them. You pity them not because they are contemptible, but because they are small and the world is not always careful with small things. And the psalm said, "This is how God holds you, for he knoweth our frame. He remembereth that we are dust. He remembereth that we are dust." This was the line he returned to most, in the late nights, when the weariness was particular and the body had reminded him once again of its limits. God does not look at a man grown old and fragile and expect him to be stone. He does not look at the weakness and find it disappointing, as if the weakness were a failure of will rather than a condition of the creature. He knows the frame. He built it. He knows it was dust to begin with and will return to dust, and that everything between the two is held together by his own sustaining. He does not demand more than dust can give. He holds what is fragile the way you hold something fragile, with particular care, with full attention, with an awareness of exactly how much pressure it can bear. For the nighttime listener, carrying the weight of whatever the day had left on them, this was the promise that made the counting possible. You were not required to be stronger than dust tonight. You were only required to be what you were, which was a creature known completely by the one who made you, held in hands that understood the precise fragility of the thing they held. The psalm widened at its end, the way a river widens when it reaches the sea, the hosts of heaven praising, the angels excelling in strength, all his works in all his dominion. The circle grew until it contained everything, every creature in every place fulfilling by its existence the great chorus that had been sounding since before he was born. And then the psalm turned, as it had to turn, because the psalm was not finally about the hosts of heaven. The hosts of heaven had their praise. This psalm was about one soul, in one moment, in one city, on one quiet night. Bless the Lord, O my soul. Not the angels, not the congregation. The word was singular on purpose. My soul, here, this man, this night, this accounting of mercies that was not quite finished but had gone on long enough that the lamp was very low and the city was very still. He said it again, quietly, not for any audience, just for the truth of it. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits. There was a psalm he had written in a moment he rarely talked about, a psalm that had frightened him a little even as he wrote it. Not frightened the way danger frightened him. He had known that kind of fear thoroughly, the fear of hearing hooves in the distance, the fear of watching a shadow move wrongly against a cave wall. This was a different kind, a stillness fear, the fear that comes when something true is spoken aloud that you had been half hoping would remain unspoken. He had put the words down slowly, the way you move slowly when you suspect the ground beneath you is holier than it looks. O Lord, thou hast searched me and known me. He remembered the weight of writing it, not a claim, a confession, a recognition that the searching had already happened, long before the psalm, long before any of his running or hiding or building or failing. The searching was not something God began when David sinned. It had been and continuous. It had been there from before memory, and when he finally wrote it down, the thing that had always been true became a thing he could no longer pretend he had not understood. He walked to the far end of the upper corridor where the lamplight did not reach. The stones were cold under his feet. He had always thought better in the dark. To be searched and known completely, what does a man do with that? His first instinct, almost every time, had been the instinct toward concealment. He knew what the years of hiding had done to him. He had become skilled at presenting certain faces and withholding others, skilled at giving the questioner the answer that satisfied without revealing the answer that was true. Saul had been looking for him for years. Saul had sent men into villages, into the wilderness, had interrogated shepherds and farmers, had come within arm's reach more than once without knowing it. David had survived because he knew how to disappear. And then he had written this psalm. Thou knowest my downsitting and mine uprising. Thou understandest my thought afar off. The thought afar off. Not the spoken word, not the visible action, not the thing done in the light where witnesses could see. The thought, before it shaped itself into intention, before it became anything a man could be held accountable for. That thought, known. There was no version of himself that God had not seen. This was the thing that had frightened him, not punishment. He had faced punishment. He had faced Nathan standing in his courtyard with the parable of the lamb, had felt the weight of what followed, had walked through all of it. He knew what consequence felt like. What frightened him about this psalm was something prior to consequence. It was simply the fact of being fully seen. Thou hast beset me behind and before, and laid thine hand upon me. Behind every past thing, the things he had done in courage and the things he had done in cowardice, the years in the wilderness, the years in the palace, the years that embarrassed him to remember. Before every future thing, every night still coming, every morning he had not yet had to face. And then the hand, laid thine hand upon me. He had thought about that phrase a long time before he understood it. It was not a hand that restrained. It was not a hand that caught him committing something he should not have been doing. It was a hand laid in the way you lay a hand on the shoulder of someone you are walking beside, which is to say, it was a hand of accompaniment, of steadiness, not trapped, held. Whither shall I go from thy spirit, or whither shall I flee from thy presence? He had tried to flee. He recognized that now, walking the palace corridor in the quiet dark, not the physical fleeing, though there had been years of that, running from Saul, running later from his own son, running from the thing inside himself that kept choosing poorly. He meant a subtler fleeing, the kind that happens in the mind at night, when a man begins to believe that what he is carrying is too particular, too private, too complex to bring to God. When he starts to feel that he has wandered into a part of himself where God does not come. When the dark room feels genuinely separate, genuinely outside of anything holy. He had felt this many times, and the psalm answered it before he could fully form the question. If I ascend up into heaven, thou art there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, thou art there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there shall thy hand lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me. There was no uttermost part. He had looked for it without meaning to. He had not found it. For the person lying in the dark tonight, in whatever room the dark has found them, this is what the psalm is saying. You have not gone anywhere God is not. The feeling of distance is not evidence of actual distance. The feeling of being outside the reach of anything good is not a report on the geography of the spirit. It is a feeling, and this psalm is older than the feeling. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, even the night shall be light about me. For the darkness hideth not from thee, but the night shineth as the day. The darkness and the light are both alike to thee. He stayed there a while. The darkness and the light are both alike to thee. Not that the darkness becomes bright. He was not promising that the difficulty disappears, that the night becomes morning simply by the invoking of a line. The darkness remains dark to the one lying in it. That is honest. But to God, it is not dark. The same knowledge, the same presence, the same attending care that fills the brightest noon fills the deepest night. The dark room is not less inhabited by God than the room full of light, which means the dark room is safe. Not safe because nothing difficult is in it, safe because God is in it, and the darkness that obscures the room from human eyes obscures nothing from Him. The insomnia that feels like abandonment is happening inside the omniscience and care of the one who made sleep and will give it back in His time. The dark is not empty. It is simply dark, and that is enough to rest inside of. He stood at the window. Jerusalem breathed below him, a city he had made his own and that had made him something he could not have become anywhere else. He thought of the earlier years. Not with the sharpness he once had, but with the softer quality of old memory, the way distant things look when the light is behind them, and you cannot quite see the details, only the shape. He had been knit together in a place he had never seen. That was what the psalm said next, and it had always stopped him, the biological intimacy of it, the way God's knowledge was not abstract but particular. Not general but cellular. My substance was not hid from thee, when I was made in secret and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. curiously wrought. The word held craft, intention, a maker who was paying attention to what he was making, who was not absent while the making happened. Thine eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect, and in thy book all my members were written, which in continuance were fashioned, when as yet there was none of them. Before the first word, before the first breath, before anything that could be called a life had begun, God had been there, writing, seeing, knowing. The same presence that knew him before he could speak had never stopped knowing him. Through all of it, through the glory and through the shame, through the nights in caves and the mornings in palaces, through the things he had done well and the things he had not survived with his character intact. He had not moved outside the range of that knowledge for a single moment in his entire life, not once. The knowledge was not interrupted by his wandering. It was not paused by his worst choices. It had followed him into the uttermost parts of whatever sea he had reached and remained. This was what had frightened him, and this, finally, was what had held him. The thing that terrified was the same thing that sheltered. To be fully known and not abandoned, to have every hidden room of yourself already visible to the one who holds you, and to still be held. This was not the knowledge of a judge cataloging evidence. It was the knowledge of a maker who had not lost interest in what he made, who had seen the substance, unperfect, in the dark place, before any of it, and had called it his own. He stayed at the window a long time. The city was very still. The knowing had always been there, from the beginning, and the beginning was not the cave, not the shepherd's field, not the first oil on his forehead. The beginning was before all of that, in a place neither dark nor bright, in the hand of the one who makes. Darkness and light are both alike to thee, and so the dark room, the quiet room, the room where sleep would not come, was not a room outside of God, but simply another room inside of him. Out of the depths, he had written those words in a place so low he was not sure language could reach it. There is a kind of suffering that sits beneath ordinary expression. A person who has lost something small can describe what they have lost. They can name it, measure it, explain it to another person who will understand. But there are deeper places. Places where the loss is so total, where the guilt so comprehensive, where the grief so far below the surface of daily life, that the ordinary instruments of language simply do not go there. The psalmists knew this. The entire tradition of lament in the Psalms is built on the recognition that there are places in human experience where all you can do is cry, and even the cry is barely a word. It is a sound before it is a sentence. It is the body reaching toward God because the mind has run out of things to say. Out of the depths have I cried unto thee, O Lord. That is where the psalm begins, not in the sanctuary, not in a moment of collected reflection, in the depths. And the psalm does not spend time apologizing for that location. It does not explain how the depths were reached, or whether they could have been avoided. It simply begins there, in the lowest place, with the cry going upward. David knew the depths by name. He had been in more than one of them. There was the year Nathan came to him with the story of the ewe lamb, and waited for David to pronounce judgment before telling him what the story meant. That was a depth, the word of what he had done, spoken back to him plainly and without mercy. Thou art the man. And then the infant who followed, 7 days of lying on the ground and fasting, 7 days of hoping the cry might turn something back, and then the child was gone. And David rose and washed his face and ate, and those around him did not understand how a man could mourn so hard and then simply stand. But he understood. The standing was not the absence of grief. It was the recognition that grief had a floor, and God was at the floor, and the cry had been heard even when the answer was not the one he needed. There was Absalom. That was a different depth entirely, a depth with a different texture. Not punishment moving outward the way Nathan's word moved outward. This was the depth of a man watching everything he had built collapse, watching his own son raise an army against him, walking out of Jerusalem in the dust with his head covered and his feet bare, while the city he had made his capital turned its face another direction. That kind of depth has no clear bottom, a man falling through that does not know when he will stop falling. And yet from there too the cry went up. From there too the Lord heard. If thou, Lord, shouldest mark iniquities, O Lord, who shall stand? The psalm asks this question knowing the answer. No one. Not one person in the history of human life has stood before perfect accounting and remained upright. Not David, who had done what he had done. Not the men on the walls of Jerusalem, who had served faithfully for decades and still carried within them the ordinary accumulations of failure and smallness and self-interest that every human life accumulates. No one stands on the basis of a clean record. This is the logic the psalm builds on, and it does not flinch from it. But there is forgiveness with thee. The pivot is small, a single conjunction, but not because we are innocent, not because the accounting comes out differently than it appears, not because there is some error in the ledger that can be corrected, but because forgiveness exists, because the God who could mark every iniquity has chosen instead to be a God in whom forgiveness lives. That is what there is with thee means. It is not a theological abstraction. It is a description of what God carries within himself. The way a man of great wealth carries within himself the capacity to pay another man's debt, not because the debt is not real, but because the resources are there and the willingness is there. Forgiveness is not the erasure of what happened. It is the standing ground for a man who cannot stand on anything else. He had needed that standing ground more than once. He had returned to it more than once. Each time it was still there. This was one of the things he had learned that could not have been learned any other way. You do not know that the standing ground holds until you have stood on it in the worst conditions. You do not know that forgiveness is real until you have needed it for something that seemed unforgivable. He knew now. The ground had held. My soul waiteth for the Lord more than they that watch for the morning. The image is specific enough to see clearly. Jerusalem had walls. The walls had watchmen. Every night, men took their stations on those walls and kept watch through the dark hours, watching the plain below the city, watching the roads that wound down into the valleys, watching for movement, watching for fire, watching for the first sign that something in the night had changed and the city needed to be warned. This was their work. They could not sleep. To sleep on watch was not a minor failure. It was a betrayal of everyone inside the walls who was sleeping in trust. So the watchmen watched, and they waited for the morning the way a man waits for something he needs badly. The gray line at the eastern edge of the sky that meant the night was ending, and the city had survived another dark. The psalm says, I wait for God more urgently than that. More than the men whose whole purpose through the night is to wait. More than the men whose waiting is itself a form of work. The soul that trusts in the Lord waits with that quality of attention, that quality of need. The morning matters because God matters. The coming of mercy matters the way the coming of dawn matters to a man who has been standing in the dark for hours. But here is the thing the psalm offers to the one who is not a watchman. The watchman cannot sleep. His waiting requires wakefulness. His post requires that he stand and watch and not close his eyes regardless of how long the night goes. That is the nature of what he is doing. But the psalm makes a distinction. It holds the watchman's waiting up as a measure of intensity. not as a prescription. The soul that trusts is not told to become a watchman. The soul that trusts is told to hope, to wait, in the way the watchman waits. But the soul that trusts does not have to be the one doing the watching. Someone is already watching. The walls are already manned. The person inside the city, the person who is not assigned to the wall, can sleep while the watchman watches. That is what the walls are for. That is what the watchmen are for. Their wakefulness is the condition of everyone else's rest. Let Israel hope in the Lord, for with the Lord there is mercy. The mercy is not the point of question. The mercy is not what is being waited for. It already exists. What is being waited for is the moment in which the mercy becomes visible. When the morning comes, and what was feared does not arrive, and the city is still standing, and the walls held, and the ones on the walls are still there. That moment of confirmation is not the creation of the mercy. It is the revelation of it. The mercy was there through the whole of the night. The watchmen stood in the mercy even while they watched. The sleepers inside slept in the mercy even while they dreamed. And with him is plenteous redemption. Plenteous. It is a word that resists rationing. A man who has plenteous water does not measure his cupfuls. The redemption available with the Lord is not doled out carefully to ensure there is enough to go around. It is not portioned out to the most deserving or withheld from the most undeserving. It is plenteous. It is more than required for everyone who comes needing it. David had tested this. He had come to that supply having exhausted every other resource and every other hope, having come from depths where no ordinary remedy could reach, and the supply had not run low. It had not been diminished by his particular need. It had been enough, and more than enough, and the word plenteous was the only honest word for it. He stood a while longer on the upper terrace, looking out over the dark city. The walls were out there. The watchmen were on them, moving slowly through their routes, watching the darkness, waiting for the gray line that would come whether they watched for it or not. The morning was already on its way. It had been on its way since the moment the night began. Nothing the watchmen did or did not do would stop it from arriving. Their faithfulness mattered, their watch mattered, but the morning was not contingent on them. It was coming. That was the nature of mornings. The watchmen were on the walls, and they would keep watching, and the morning would come, and the one who trusted could simply sleep. There was a line in one of the later Psalms that he found himself saying aloud some nights, not performing it, not reciting it for anyone, just saying it because it was true. Return unto thy rest, O my soul. He had written it long ago, in a season when rest had felt like a country he could remember but not reach. He had written many things in such seasons, but this line had stayed with him in a particular way, the way certain words stay, not because they are the most beautiful, but because they are the most necessary, because they name something the soul needs named before it can move toward it. He said it again now, quietly, in the upper room, with Jerusalem still below him and the night well advanced. Return unto thy rest, O my soul. He was not reciting. He was not praying in any formal sense. He was simply telling himself the truth the way you tell a child the truth, gently, without argument, because the child is tired and does not need to be convinced, only reminded. Before the invitation to rest, before the great middle of the poem, there was an opening so plain it almost startled you when you first heard it. Not a doctrine, not a formula, just this: I love the Lord, because he hath heard my voice and my supplications. That was it. That was the foundation of everything that followed. Not a theological argument, not a demonstration of worthiness. I love him because he listened. The relationship was built on a single, irreducible fact, that when the voice went up, an ear inclined toward it, that the cry did not dissolve into empty air, that something, someone, received it, because he hath inclined his ear unto me. Therefore will I call upon him as long as I live. As long as I live. He turned that phrase over slowly. The commitment was total, and the reason was specific. Not because of what God had promised in the abstract, not because the covenant required it, but because once, or many times that felt like once, the ear had inclined, the listening had been real, and that was enough to build a life on. That was enough to make a man say, as long as I live, I will keep calling. As long as I live, I will not stop speaking into the space between myself and the one who hears. He had been young when he first understood this. He had not known that he was understanding it. He had simply cried out, alone on a hillside, or alone in a cave, or alone in the middle of a crowd that did not know him as he was. And something had answered, not always in words, not always in the way he had asked, but the answer had come. And he had felt it, and the feeling had marked him permanently. You do not forget the first time you know that you have been heard. It changes the way you speak for the rest of your life. The psalm did not stop at the opening. It went immediately into the dark, the way honest psalms do. The sorrows of death compassed me, and the pains of hell gat hold upon me. He had not written those words lightly. He had written them from inside them. The sorrows of death had not been metaphorical. They had been specific. Specific nights, specific losses, specific moments when the distance between where he was and where he needed to be had seemed impossible to cross. I found trouble and sorrow. The economy of the language concealed the weight of it. Trouble and sorrow. As if those two words could hold everything they had to hold. Then called I upon the name of the Lord. The sequence mattered. He had thought about this often. The trouble came first. The sorrow arrived first. And then, not before, not preemptively, not in some posture of spiritual readiness, then the call. This was not a psalm written by a man who had avoided trouble by praying at the right moment. This was a psalm written by a man who had found himself already submerged, already deep in what should not have been survivable, and had called from there. The psalm did not promise that the calling would prevent the depths. It promised something different and more honest, that the call was possible from the depths, and that it would be heard from there. He had tested this. He knew it to be true. Gracious is the Lord and righteous. Yea, our God is merciful. 3 words, and he had held them in different lights over the years, the way you hold a stone in different lights, watching the color shift. Gracious. There was a quality of undeserved movement in that word, a leaning toward that preceded any merit. Righteous, not cold and exacting. Not a righteousness that pressed you down, but a righteousness that was in some way on your side, because it included the righting of what had gone wrong. And merciful. He had needed that word more than the others. He had needed a God whose response to the full account of a man's life was not the response the full account deserved. Gracious, righteous, merciful. He had slept on those 3 words more than once. They were, he had decided, enough to sleep on. They covered enough ground. He settled further against the wall of the upper room. The lamp had burned low. He was no longer standing, no longer pacing. He had moved without quite deciding to move, the way the body sometimes knows before the mind that it is time to be still. He sat against the cool stone and let the night hold its shape around him. Return unto thy rest, O my soul, for the Lord hath dealt bountifully with thee. The invitation was not vague, it was addressed. O my soul, not the soul in general, not the soul as a category, but this specific soul, his soul, the one that had been running one way or another for most of a long life. and the word return implied that rest was not a new destination, but a familiar one. The soul had been there before. The soul belonged there. It had wandered out during the day's anxiety, during the night's reviewing, during the long inward accounting of what had gone wrong and what remained unfinished. And now it was being called back, not commanded, called. Return, come back. The room is still yours. The bountiful dealing of the Lord. He ran through it slowly, not in order, not systematically, just the way an old man moves through a house he has lived in for many years, stopping at this room and that one, not because he needs something from each room, but because the rooms contain things. The cave, the way the morning had come when it seemed the morning would not come. Absalom, which he could not think about even now without the old wound reopening. And yet he was still here, still breathing, still holding the thread. The infant who had died. He had stopped grieving in a way that surprised people. He had said, I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me. And he had meant it. That was the bountiful dealing, not the absence of the losses, but the presence of something that survived. The mercy that was not canceled by grief. The hearing that continued in the seasons when he had barely had words to speak. Dealt bountifully. He considered that phrase. Not sparingly, not reluctantly, not with precise measurement, enough and no more. Bountifully. There was a fullness in that word, a quality of overflow. He had been given more than the minimum required to survive. He had been given enough to remember, enough to write down, enough to pass forward. The Psalms themselves were evidence. They had come from somewhere that was not entirely him, had come through him from some surplus he had not earned and could not fully account for. The bountiful dealing included the songs. It included the long life in which there had been time to sing them. He thought of the people who would hear these words after he was gone. He did not know who they would be, or what their depths would look like, or what trouble and sorrow they would have found before they called upon the name of the Lord. He only knew that the psalm would still be true for them, that the ear would still be inclined, that the bountiful dealing would cover their lives the way it had covered his, not by removing the trouble, but by being present inside it, by hearing the call that came from the middle of it, by meeting the soul that had wandered far from rest and saying simply, return, come back. The room is still yours. The lamp gave a small movement in some draught he could not feel. The flame settled. The room was very quiet. Return unto thy rest, O my soul. And he found, as the night deepened around him, that he was in fact returning, the way a man returns to a room he had almost forgotten was his. He had learned this late, the way most men learn the most important things, late and at cost. The psalm was Solomon's. That itself was something worth sitting with. Solomon, who had built the thing David was not permitted to build, who had stood inside the completed house of God and offered the dedicatory prayer that David had spent decades imagining, who had received the wisdom and the wealth and the long uninterrupted peace that David had never quite known. Even Solomon had written a psalm about the vanity of striving. Even the man who had everything understood that none of it had been built by him in any final sense. The foundation was older than the structure, deeper than the effort. Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. Solomon knew this. David had known it before Solomon found the words. He had wanted to build the temple. The desire had been genuine, had been holy in its origin, had come from a real love for the God who had kept him across so many years and so many landscapes. He had said as much to Nathan, the prophet. He had sat in his own house in cedar and looked out at the tent where the ark still dwelled, and the disproportion had troubled him. I am dwelling in a house of cedar, he had said, and the ark of God dwelleth within curtains. There was sincerity in that. There was no vanity in the desire, or at least very little. He had wanted to build something worthy of the one who had built him, and the word had come back through Nathan in the night. You shall not build it, not because the desire was wrong, because the time was not right, and the man was not the one appointed for it. The house would be built by another hand. He had not received that word easily. That would be the charitable way of describing it. He had received it, yes. He had accepted it. But the acceptance had taken years to become peace, and the peace had taken more years still to become something he could call gratitude. Because what you discover when you are told that the thing you most want to build is not yours to build is how much of your building has always been about you. How much of the effort was love for God, and how much was the need to be the man who did it, who completed the great thing, whose name would be attached to the monument. These are not always easy to separate. They grow together in the heart like grain and tares, and only the most careful hand can distinguish them. The psalm understood this. It did not condemn the builder. It did not say building was wrong or that effort was foolish. It said something more precise, more surgical. Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain. The labor itself is not the problem. The foundation is the question. What holds the thing up when the builder sleeps, when the builder weakens, when the builder is gone? If the answer is only the builder's continued effort, then the structure is already failing in a way that the exterior has not yet revealed. David had strained against this truth his whole life. There had been so many structures, not only the temple, the kingdom itself, assembled year by year through campaigns and alliances and force of will and grief that he had not always processed in the right order. His family, which he had failed to build well in ways that still woke him sometimes in the small hours with a grief that had nowhere to go. Absalom's face, the image of his son's face. That particular weight never fully lifted. He had tried to hold the family together by force of desire and found that desire was not enough. He had tried to rule wisely and found that wisdom arrived unevenly, in bursts, often after the decision that needed it had already been made. He had tried to keep his own soul intact through the long years of betrayal and wilderness and moral failure and recovery. And the soul that had survived was not one he had maintained through careful effort. It was one that had been maintained from the outside, from above, from a keeping that had nothing to do with his own vigilance. Except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh but in vain. He thought about the watchmen on the walls tonight. He could hear them sometimes from the upper rooms, the occasional exchange of voices in the dark, the movement of sandals on stone. They were faithful men doing necessary work. He did not diminish it. But the psalm named a limitation that every watchman eventually learns. The watchman's wakefulness does not guarantee the city's safety. It contributes. It matters. But the city's safety, in the final accounting, rests on something the watchman cannot supply simply by staying awake. There had been nights when the walls were manned and the city fell anyway. And there had been nights when the walls were thin and the people were few, and the city survived by what could only be called mercy. He had been that city more than once, thin-walled, poorly positioned, surrounded, and something had kept him anyway, not because his watchfulness was sufficient, but because the keeper did not depend on his watchfulness in order to keep. It is vain for you to rise up early, to sit up late, to eat the bread of sorrows, the bread of sorrows. He had eaten that bread. He knew its texture. It is the bread you eat when you are reviewing the day at midnight, when you are calculating what went wrong and what could still be salvaged and what is already lost. It is the bread of the man who cannot let the night be night, who turns tomorrow's problems over and over in the dark as though the turning accomplishes something, who rises before dawn because the mind will not stop working even when the body has given out. He had eaten it in the cave. He had eaten it in the palace. The cave had been more honest about what kind of bread it was. For so he giveth his beloved sleep. The word beloved had always stopped him here. Not servant, not warrior, not the man who rises early and sits up late and proves himself through the exhaustion of his striving. Beloved, as though the sleep were a gift pressed into the hands of someone precious, not awarded to the one who had worked the hardest or planned the most carefully or earned it by the quality of his effort. Given to the beloved, given simply because the giver had determined that this one was held dear and sleep was good and the night was already in his keeping. He had been building something all his life. He could see it now from here, from this end of it, in a way he could not have seen it from the middle. He had been building, and much of what he had built had stood, and much of it had not, and the ratio was not what he would have chosen. But the things that stood were not standing because of the quality of his craftsmanship. They were standing because they had been built on something he had not laid down himself. The throne, the covenant, the line that would continue through him beyond anything he could see. He had contributed to these things. He had not built them. There was a difference, and it had taken him most of his life to understand it not as diminishment, but as relief. The weight is not mine to carry. It never was. God builds lives the way he builds houses, from a depth that human hands cannot reach, from a foundation that exists before the first stone is placed, before the first plan is drawn, before the builder wakes in the morning full of ambition and begins measuring. The foundation is already there. The house is, in some sense, already known. What the builder adds is real. What the builder contributes is not nothing. But the builder did not make the ground. The builder did not determine what would hold. His children came to his mind now, the living ones, the ones who had survived what survival required in a household shaped by a man who was trying to do too many things at once. He had not built them well, by any reckoning that he applied to himself with honesty. And yet they were alive, and some of them had found what he had found, not because he had been a sufficient father, but because the maker of all of them was not limited by the quality of the fathering. Children as heritage, arrows in the hand. The image from the psalm was not sentimental. Arrows require a hand that knows what it is doing, a direction, a release. He had not always provided those things, but there was a hand behind his hand that he was only beginning to understand had been directing things far longer than he had been paying attention. He set the thought down. He was doing it again, the reviewing, the accounting, the sitting up late over things that were not going to be resolved tonight and were not finally his to resolve. He set it down deliberately. The way you set down something heavy that you have been carrying so long you stop noticing the weight, until the moment you put it on the ground and feel your shoulders rise. The night received him, not dramatically, simply, the way a room receives someone who finally decides to stop pacing and sit. He giveth his beloved sleep, and he had been beloved long enough, and striven long enough, and tonight, at last, he understood that the two were not the same thing. The last psalm he came to on those quiet nights was not really a night psalm at all. It was a morning psalm, a psalm for everything, and that was why he saved it for last. It began where everything begins, which is not in Jerusalem and not in any room, but in the heights. Praise ye the Lord from the heavens, praise him in the heights. Not the heights as metaphor, the heights as actual location, the place above cloud and wind where the angels stood arrayed in their orders, where the hosts moved in their ancient patterns, where praise was not something you decided to offer, but something that had been happening before any human throat had learned to form words. That was where this psalm started, not with a man, not with a king, with the whole upper architecture of creation, already in motion, already in chorus, requiring nothing from the figure leaning quietly against the palace wall. He had spent a great portion of his life watching the sky, not as a mystic, as a shepherd first, and then as a fugitive, and then as a king who could not always sleep. The stars had been his companions through all of it, cold and remote and burning, and he had sometimes felt them to be indifferent. The night above the cave had pressed down like something sealed. The night above the hill pastures of his boyhood had been wide and careless, scattered with light that asked nothing of him and offered nothing he could name. But the psalm had something to say about that. Praise ye him, sun and moon. Praise him, all ye stars of light. Not indifferent, praising. The distinction settled into him the way it had settled into him every time he came to this psalm, which was the slow recognition that what he had read as silence was not silence. What he had read as indifference was participation. The stars he had watched from the cave floor, the stars he had watched as a boy while the sheep settled around him, the stars visible now through the latticed window of the upper court, they had been praising the whole time. He had simply been too consumed by his own circumstances to hear it. Praise ye him, all his angels. Praise ye him, all his hosts. The word hosts carries weight that ordinary reading does not always give it. These were not decorative figures in the sky. These were ordered ranks, a vast assembly, a company whose number no census had ever reached, and they praised, not intermittently, not when the mood was upon them. They praised in the way that the sun rises, which is to say, because it is their nature, and because the one who made them for exactly this. Then the psalm descended. It came down from the heights the way dawn comes down, gradually, touching each layer of the created order as it moved. Praise the Lord from the earth, ye dragons, and all deeps. The deeps. He knew something about deeps. He had written about them himself. Out of the depths have I cried. And he had meant the interior depths, the places in a man where language dissolves and only the raw sound remains. But the psalm meant the actual depths, the places beneath the floor of the ocean, the dark water under everything, where light had never reached and no human eye had gone. Even there, even in those places, which were as far from the palace roof as anything could be, even there the praise was occurring. The darkness under the deeps was not empty. It was full. It had always been full. Even on the nights when he had lain in his own interior darkness and believed he was alone in it. Fire and hail, snow and vapor, stormy wind fulfilling his word. He had been in storms. He had crossed terrain and weather that seemed to be working against him, wind that pushed back, hail that drove into the face, cold that made the hands slow and the thinking slow. He had interpreted some of that as opposition, as the landscape conspiring with his enemies. But the psalm had another word for it, fulfilling. The stormy wind was not resisting the word, it was fulfilling it. Everything in the night sky, everything in the weather, everything in the elements that could seem hostile or arbitrary, all of it was in service, all of it moving in obedience to an instruction he could not hear but which was nevertheless being carried out with precision. The psalm came lower still, mountains and all hills, fruitful trees and all cedars. He had camped beneath the cedars of Lebanon. He had crossed through the hill country more times than he had kept account of. He had not thought of those places as participants. He thought of them as terrain. The psalm corrected that quietly, without argument, simply by naming them in the list. Beasts and all cattle, creeping things and flying fowl, everything that moved on the surface of the earth, everything small enough to miss and large enough to fear, everything that crawled beneath the notice of the powerful. The whole teeming, breathing population of the created world was in the chorus. Not loudly. The sound was not the sound of a great assembly pressing against the walls. It was distributed, spread, across every surface, present in every breath of every creature, quiet enough that you had to stop striving to hear it. And then the psalm arrived at the human portion of the list. Kings of the earth, and all people, princes, and all judges of the earth. He was in that line. He had always been in that line. From the first time he had read this psalm, he had recognized himself there, among the kings, among the people, not separate from the chorus, but part of it, assigned a voice in something that had been going on since before he drew his first breath. Young men and maidens, old men and children, old men. He had been a young man once, wild-haired and quick, and the psalm had held a place for him even then. And now he was old, careful with his steps, slow to stand in the mornings, and the psalm still held a place for him here. Old men and children were named together, and the distance between them was not gray. Eat in the psalm's accounting, because both were in the chorus. Both were part of what the Lord had made. Both were held by the one whose name alone is excellent. Let them praise the name of the Lord, for his name alone is excellent. His glory is above the earth and heaven. Not a complicated conclusion, not a theological argument that required working through, just the simple observation that everything the psalm had named, the angels and the stars and the deeps and the fire and the hail and the mountains and the cattle and the kings and the old men, all of it had been pointing at one name. The praise was not scattered, it converged. Everything in the created order was, in some way below the level of human cognition, oriented toward the same point, the way rivers are oriented toward the sea without knowing it, the way the stars are oriented toward a sea without knowing it, the way the stars are oriented toward a sea without knowing it, the way the stars are oriented toward a fixed point in the turning sky. This was what happened as the psalm widened. He had expected the widening to feel dilute. When you move from one man to the whole cosmos, the individual seems to dissolve. But the psalm did not work that way. The wider it went, the quieter it became. And the quieter it became, the more it sounded like rest. This was not the silence of emptiness. This was the silence of completion. The silence at the center of a great hum, the frequency below language where the whole world met itself in praise, and the meeting was so total and so constant that it had ceased to be audible, not because it is stopped, but because it is too fundamental to notice. He settled, not a decision. His body made the settling before his mind did. The back of his head touched the carved stone and the weight he had been carrying. The last small weight that had remained after the psalms had taken the larger ones. That too released, not dramatically, but the way tension releases from a muscle when it finally believes it is allowed to stop. The city was dark below. The streets were empty. The lamps in the windows of the lower city had gone out one by one over the course of the night, and now only the stars remained, doing what the psalm said they were doing, which was praising, which had always looked like shining. He was part of the chorus. He did not have to conduct it. He did not have to sustain it. He could close his eyes and it would continue. The mountains would continue. The deeps would continue. The sun, somewhere on the other side of the night, was already preparing its part of the chorus and would deliver it at the appointed hour, whether he was awake to see it or not. The angels had not paused. The hosts had not waited. The stars burned on in their ordered stations, and the praise ascended from every creature on the face of the deep, and the name of the Lord remained excellent above the earth and the heaven. His breathing slowed. The psalm was still in him somewhere, moving the way water moves through stone, the way it had moved in the cave, below the dying fire, below the dark, below sleep itself. The praise did not require his wakefulness. This was the thing he had come to understand very late, which is when most of the true things arrive. The chorus did not depend on his voice. His voice was a gift he could add, and he had added it. He had added it all his life in songs that had come out of him in pain and in wonder and in repentance and in joy, and all of that had been received. All of it had joined the larger praise, and it was still there, still rising, even now when he was nearly too tired to speak. The stars did not need him awake to continue praising, and somehow that was the most restful thing he had ever understood. He lay down, not at the parapet, not in the corridor, not beside the low lamp that had kept him company through the watches. He lay down in the room, on the bed, in the dark, and the act itself was the end of the striving. The body knew before the mind what lying down meant. It meant, I am not the one keeping watch tonight. It meant, there is a keeper, and I am not him. He had written the words when he was young, before the cave, before the throne, before the weight of it. He had written them from somewhere he could not fully explain even now, as though the words had come through him rather than from him. I will both lay me down in peace and sleep, for thou, Lord, only makest me dwell in safety. He had written them and then lived into them across every decade that followed. There had been a boy on a hillside once, not yet a king, not yet a fugitive, who had lain down under the stars with a small fire at his back and the sheep settled nearby and the night enormous above him. He had not known what was coming. He had simply lain down. The fire had burned low, and the stars had continued their circuit, and something had kept him while he slept, though he did not yet have the words for what it was. There had been a man pressed against the stone floor of a cave, his cloak over his shoulders, listening to the breathing of men who were also afraid, who had followed him into hiding because they had nowhere else to go. That man had also slept, not easily, not without the weight of what was outside the cave, but he had slept, because sleep had come to him as a gift he had not earned, given by the same hand that had given the morning. And now there was an old king in Jerusalem, in a room that had outlasted his youth and his exile and his grief, in a city that was still breathing below the window, in a night that held the same stars he had always known, the same person, the same keeper, the same night, understood more deeply now than it had ever been. This is what the word only carries. Thou, Lord, only makest me dwell in safety, not the walls of Jerusalem, not the locked door, not the sons posted at the gate, or the soldiers in the outer courts, not the familiar room or the familiar dark, the Lord only, which means the safety is not located in the circumstances. It does not depend on the circumstances being safe. It depends on Him, and He does not change when the circumstances change. The room is safe because He makes it safe. The dark is safe because He is in it. The sleeper is held because He does not let go. No watching required. The watch is already kept. The morning is already prepared, already moving toward the city from the east, already certain, already given. The watchman on the walls will see it come. The sleeper need not wait for it. He may sleep while it comes. The sparrow has found her house, the swallow her nest. The soul has returned to its rest. The stars have been praising since before the first night anyone lay beneath them. The deeps are praising. The fire and the hail and the stormy wind are fulfilling His word. Everything the dark contains is inside His keeping, not outside it. And you, wherever the dark finds you tonight, whatever room, whatever silence, Whatever weight came to bed with you and is not yet let go, the same keeper, the same word, the same night, held by the same hands that have held every night since the first one. Return unto thy rest. He giveth his beloved sleep. Bless the Lord, O my soul. The wings are there. They were always there. He lay in the dark, and the city lay below him, and the stars continued. And the psalm was still moving somewhere below waking, the way water moves in deep ground, slow and certain, and without effort. He was nearly gone. The watch was kept, and the one who kept him did not sleep, and the rock held, and the wings were still there, and there was nothing left to do but rest.